Uncle Marsh had always been the black sheep of our family, a thorn in my father's side and a constant reminder of how corrupt and decayed our ancestral roots truly were. Sebastian Frederick Marsh was my mother's elder brother, a genetic throwback, a deviant, and, if the rumors surrounding him were true, a man acquainted with the most hellish of sins. His appearance was enough to make the most stoic of hearts skip a beat before its shambling gait. Flat-headed, thick-lipped, and possessing the largest, glassiest bulging eyes found in the sockets of any earthbound creature. His appearance was nothing less than outlandish. He would stumble along the cobbled streets of Barton Village every Saturday morning in his weekly sojourn to the local stores. The journey caused his neighbors great unease, and passerby would cross the street in an effort to avoid exchanging even the simplest of pleasantries with the man. I was particularly disturbed by my uncle's visage, as I, unfortunately, shared a few of his more loathsome traits myself. Thankfully, however, these were less pronounced and shocking than those found on my uncle's grim face. My mother, too, shared what was known in Barton as the Marsh look. Although her deviant features, like mine, were softer and even less obvious than my own. She got away lightly indeed, with large watery eyes, her only obvious heritage of the tainted Marsh bloodline. Uncle Marsh lived alone, tucked away in a rotting abode that lurked and leaned queerly at odd angles at the back of Gunner's Cloth, a feral grotto that skirted the cemetery at the south end of the village. It was a lonesome stretch of sepulchre woodland, home only to the witch elms, the creeping moss, and my gloomy uncle. Many an odd tale was attached to the Gunner's Cloth. Strange lights and raised voices were often heard from the depths of the woods on those days leading up to the nights of Hallows Eve and Walpurgis. It was not unknown for local pets, and occasionally even children, to go missing and turn up dead on the mornings after those nights, when the frogs croaked loudly and the owls hooted their omens of warning. I remember when I was very young, my mother issued me a warning to never enter the Gunner's Cloth, despite my uncle living there, and I often wondered just what witchcraft was being played out in secret beneath the skeletal trees. These warnings were ubiquitous among all Barton children, and with good reason. Before I was born, a local child had been found dead in the woods, half submerged in the black slop that had once been a stream passing through the cloth. Little was done about the matter. It was assumed that the child had fallen into the muck and drowned, but every Barton resident was quick to attribute a more sinister conclusion to the life of little Maggie Hagen. Despite the macabre reputation, or perhaps because of it, the whole area was the haunting ground of young boys during the summer months, and sadly, with the great embarrassment, my uncle was seen as something of a local boogeyman by my peers. As a result, he suffered relentless taunting at the hands of Barton's children. There was precious little else to do in the village during the school summer break, and the taunting of my uncle became something of a local sport. Boys would prove their mettle by hurling rocks at the windows of the Gunner's Cloth cottage where my uncle resided, or knocking on his door only to flee as the frog-faced resident cautiously answered their call before slinking back into the dark of his home. Being the nephew of Mad Marsh meant that by proxy, I too suffered from the attentions of my uncle's tormentors, and I tried desperately to make myself invisible in and out of school. I succeeded in this endeavor to such a level that I had successfully alienated myself from everyone outside of my family in just a few short years. One year, on Halloween, the onslaught of abuse directed towards my uncle reached such feverish heights that it culminated in a planned mass egging of his home. Only one boy in town possessed enough bravado to see this task to conclusion, however: Jamie Birtle. It was Jamie alone who entered the Gunner's Cloth on that dreadful night, chest puffed out and a box of rotten eggs held confidently in his hands. When the boy finally returned, many hours later, to the circle of children crowning the edge of that necromantic woodland, waiting in anticipation for their champion, he was forever and irreversibly changed, transmuted, transformed, and left naught but a shell of what was once a lively child. He staggered out of the woodlands a dumb and silent specter. Poor Jamie Birtle, the terror of all children younger than himself, said nothing about what he had seen in the dark that night, nor would he ever speak a single syllable again his whole miserable life. Eventually, the glassy-eyed mute was taken away from his parents and moved to the Byron House, a home for the mentally disadvantaged. There he stayed for many years, banging his head against the wall of his cell to a silent, alien rhythm, until fate gave him the opportunity to escape his confines and leap to his death. Exactly 13 years since he first lurched out of the shadows of the wych elm trees. My uncle was questioned about the incident, of course, but denied ever seeing the boy, let alone speaking to him or causing him harm. This event left me even more isolated than the other children. Before that night, they might have included me in their torments, but once Jamie had been forever silenced, they avoided me completely. I very rarely saw Uncle Marsh in person. Occasionally, he would show up at a family get-together or function to make a token effort to remind us that he still existed in this world, only to disappear just as abruptly as he had arrived. My father in particular despised the man. He hated the appearance of his brother-in-law, and he hated that his wife and son were kin to the man. But most of all, he hated the way Marsh collected queer objects in strange moldy tomes. Marsh was something of a scholar, at least of a certain sort, and loved to devour information from his astounding collection of books. His library consisted of a mass of sprawling grimoires and papers scattered around his living room in no discernible order, a chaotic crumbling mess of ancient and esoteric knowledge. Many of those decaying, musty volumes were written in languages unspoken in the isolated villages and hamlets of northwest England. Archaic German, French, Latin, Greek, and scripts so wholly alien in structure that they must have been impossibly extraterrestrial in origin. Other, far stranger items dotted the cramped corners of the cottage that Marsh called home. Warped bent skulls, exotic stuffed birds, crystals shaped in geometric arrangements that were maddeningly complex. This was the legacy of my Uncle Marsh, a repulsive, isolated, semi-antiquarian, semi-human recluse, obsessed with the forbidden and in love with the wicked and strange. These memories and thoughts flashed vividly in my mind as I sat opposite the stern, cold face of Mr. Fisher, my family's long-suffering solicitor. Just seconds ago, he had impassionately read aloud the contents of my uncle's late will and testament, in which a man I barely knew and had good reason to despise had left me all of his earthly and unearthly possessions. Uncle Marsh's death had been as singular and strange as his life. In the early morning of July 24th, 1954, he had stood naked on the sands of Seascale Beach in Copeland, Cumbria, and walked slowly and deliberately into the waiting maw of the churning Irish Sea. A trail of large, flat footprints in the sand and a pile of scattered clothing were all that had remained of the man. Although a body was never found, he was declared legally dead some years after, and had left instructions with Mr. Fisher that I, his only nephew, was to receive all he had ever owned. The significance of the location of his demise was not lost upon me. For decades ago, my family had lived in the town of Seascale. The sea had always been in my family's blood, and many a Marsh had took to the waves as fishermen, sailors, or even pirates. At least if one was to believe the various myths and legends surrounding us, for the Marsh blood was tainted, or so the stories said. The original branch of the family had come to England from the United States, where a great deal of my relatives had lived in the decaying and damned port town of Innsmouth, Massachusetts. Innsmouth itself was a nest of horrid myths and repulsive witch lore. We had come to Cumbria under a cloak of dark suspicion and dread, chased out by the locals as warlocks and werewolves, forced across the bitter Atlantic, and finally ejected upon the shores of Old Blighty. Whatever it was that had segregated us from the other branches of the family, for many a Marsh still resided in rotting Innsmouth, none can say. My grandparents certainly would not discuss the matter. My own family had to move away from Copeland and into the small village of Barton, Cheshire, due to a chance meeting between my mother and father during a blistering hot summer holiday, which my father had chosen to spend by the seaside. My father had been a keen lover of architecture, from ancient Roman ruins to Georgian estates. He had traveled the length and breadth of Britain in search of historic adventures. It was during such a trip that he learned of Seascale and its magnificent Victorian hotel, the Scafell. During his stay in the town, he had encountered my mother on the beach as she collected various seashells, live crabs, and bits of driftwood. Enraptured by her large green eyes and raven black hair, my father spent much of the summer with the strange girl who was to become my mother, and they quickly became close friends and confidants. Some months later, the two young lovers were engaged and made the move to my father's home village, marrying at the parish church before buying a home in one of the cramped and sloping alleys of shadow-haunted Barton. Eventually, there had been an unwelcome catch to this otherwise auspicious joining. Sebastian, my mother's elder brother, would also be making the move to Barton with them. My grandparents, you see, were sadly in no fit state to look after the man, who was himself somewhat mentally disadvantaged, or backwards, as my father would say, and wholly ignorant of many social norms we often take for granted in this day and age. The elder Marshes were hopelessly advanced in age too, and it was clear that they feared for their son's well-being when the inevitable shedding of their mortal coil took them to the cold and unwelcoming grave. So, with great reluctance, but also out of love for his wife, my father agreed to take Sebastian with them to Barton, where he lived with them for several months before finally acquiring the decomposing cottage in the woods behind the cemetery. Not long after my parents' marriage, my Marsh grandparents succumbed to a kind of wasting disease. I had never actually seen either of them, nor had my father encountered them more than a handful of times, as they did not have the strength to attend their daughter's wedding. Sebastian and my mother both attended the funeral in Seascale, in which a few gray, shadowy strangers appeared, many of them also being the odd martial look. It was during this time my uncle acquired the vast bulk of his blighted library and bizarre trinkets from my grandparents' home, nestled as they were in the boarded-up attic bedroom in which they had strangely spent the majority of their later years in total seclusion. The years passed by in Barton, and while my parents made a home for themselves and started a family, my uncle continued to live alone in the woods, his collection of fungal books and stuffed animals his only companion. As I have already mentioned, I was by no means close to my uncle, and although I did not hate him with the burning vitriol my father had reserved for the man, he had still unnerved and nauseated me on the few occasions I was unlucky enough to be in the same room as him, and I was genuinely taken aback by being made his sole heir. All this no doubt accounted for the puzzled look that must have graced my face, and to which roused Mr. Fisher to once again break me away from my daydreaming with a sort of deliberate cough. Snapping out of my thoughts, I focused on the solicitor and smiled a weak, apologetic expression, and he proceeded to inform me that the cottage was in a cankerous state of decline and would be unsafe and unfit for habitation, and advised me strongly from entering it, instead suggesting I hire a few locals to fetch me whatever items I desire and deposit them at my own home. He assured me that any effort made to restore the cottage would be nothing but a cash sink and a complete waste of time. It was decayed even by the standards of the other groaning properties that dotted the woods, and truth be told, I had no desire to enter it. He gave me a few more details about various bits and pieces my uncle had left me. A few pounds squirreled away in a bank account, and also the residence that my grandparents had lived in back in Seascale, which I simply asked him to put up for sale on my behalf and to be sold as cheaply as possible. As luck would have it, he managed to sell it quickly to a distant relative, a Marsh cousin who still resided in the seaside town and wished for whatever reason to acquire the property. After leaving Mr. Fisher to his paperwork, I left his office and headed straight to my parents' home to talk about the matter with them both in full. My father seemed quite dismissive of the whole affair, assuming, wrongly, that I would have no interest in anything that had belonged to his deceased nemesis. My mother, on the other hand, seemed greatly unnerved by the matter, at first probing me to see what my intentions were regarding my uncle's belongings. Upon hearing that I would be taking them all to my home and cataloging them at my leisure, she could hardly contain her anxiety. This confused me greatly. I assured her that I simply wished to see if there was anything of worth to be sold to collectors, and this seemed to calm her briefly. Finding some local strong-arms to move the immense hoard of junk from my uncle's cottage and to my home proved to be quite difficult at first. Most men of labor in Barton proved to be stupefying in their reluctance to enter Gunner's Cloth and superstitious regarding the Marsh name. In the end, I was able to hire a few Polish laborers who, despite being superstitious themselves, were strangers to Barton and ignorant of the mark upon my family's name. I busied myself with work during the week or so it took to ransack my uncle's cottage, and at first barely noticed the hoard of books, stuffed animals, skulls, crystals, and various other bric-a-brac that I had the workers stack as neatly as possible in my cellar. By the time they had finished, the once vacant space beneath my house had become a labyrinth worthy of Crete, a Tartarus of crinkled yellow papers and moaning, sagging shelves. Fortunately, I had fitted the old cellar with electricity when I moved in, but the feeble light provided by that one naked bulb hanging in the center of the room seemed to cast more shadow than light, and gave the various glass-eyed dead animals a haunting quality that kept me away from the collection until I could find someone to take the whole ungodly collection off my hands. The whole collection stayed well out of my mind and life for some weeks to come, as work kept me busy and I put off my once planned mass cataloging in favor of working towards a promotion at work, where I worked as a minor clerk. However, when said promotion passed me by, I took a few weeks' leave from my job and decided to see how much money I could make from selling my uncle's grim treasure trove. Working through the collection proved to be a lesson in patience, and it took what seemed like a lifetime to separate my uncle's notes and diaries from actual printed books and handwritten manuscripts. When I finally did so, I had before me a collection of wicked and unwholesome tomes, musty, fat, and swollen with hundreds of pages of information. Some of the books dated back centuries. The volumes before me threw me into a state of excitement at the possibility of how much cash could be coughed up by a willing collector. I wrote down the names of as many books as I could. There was Contes des Ghouls by Comte d'Ariette, Der Vermis Mysteries, penned by necromancer Ludwig Prynne. There was also an English translation of a book called Things of the Water, with its original title, Cathat Aquadingen, presented on the inner pages in a sprawling, spidery penmanship that I suspected to be my uncle's creation. The latter was filled with pages of notes written by my uncle, and various rites and rituals underlined in pencil appeared sporadically throughout the interior. I tried my best to skim this book, being one of the few written in English, but its contents were so haphazardly laid out and unorganized that I simply could not digest any significant information. From within, instead relying upon various words underlined by my uncle. These included Father Dagon, Mother Hydra, Cthulhu, Yonth-Le, Ubo-Sathla, Azathoth, and others, stranger arrangements of letters. Admittedly, I was totally ignorant of the contents of all the books presented before me and dismissed them as either works of fiction or loose fantastical treatises of witchcraft and the occult. Neither of these topics interested me in the slightest, so I decided to write down all I could think of as interesting to collectors, such as titles, authors, dates, and the strange names of pseudo-gods and prehistoric people, and put them in a letter that I sent off to several rare booksellers in London. It did not take long for a reply to reach me. One Dr. Artemis Harlan Glass, a collector and bibliophile, had been put in touch with me via one of his contacts and wrote me a fevered response. His excitement barely contained within his beautifully worded letter. He offered to buy the entire collection from me for a king's ransom. It was a six-figure sum so high that I had to sit down immediately upon reading it in order to finish his letter in full and had to reread it several times to let its contents sink in fully. Dr. Glass had also made it clear that he wanted any and all personal notes made by the book's previous owners in full, which I understood given the gibberish contents contained within the tomes. However, I decided that I would not hand over my uncle's diaries, for whatever absurd sentimental reasons I may have attached to them. In my reply to the doctor, I simply stated that the collection had come as is, and that no notes had been found among them. I did, however, smooth this over by stating that several of the books had passages underlined, with a few scribbles here and there denoting their manuals and page numbers, where the other notes and information could be found. It wasn't quite the spiderweb of information the doctor had sought, but it appeared to please him nonetheless, and he organized to come and collect the books in person at a prearranged date, just a few days after his reply to my offer. I informed my parents over some afternoon tea of what the doctor had offered me for the books, and to my humor, my father nearly spat out a mouthful of Earl Grey upon hearing that his son was to become so fabulously wealthy. He seemed overjoyed at the news, not for any dreams of personal gain. He had always been the non-materialistic type, but at the prospect of a life such money could provide for me. I knew that he was also secretly happy that being related to Sebastian Marsh had actually paid off in the end, and the money was at once a source of sweet revenge for him and an ointment to smooth over the wounds left by various clashes. My mother's reaction was somewhat similar to my father's, but I could not help but think that it was all a put-on, an act, and that she truly did not want to see my uncle's library in the hands of a stranger. If she had but voiced her concerns, I may have changed my mind, or at least sold perhaps only half of the collection left to me. I informed her that I intended to keep my uncle's diaries and personal notes, but she simply shrugged while nursing a lukewarm cup of tea. My father made a comment about how they would be used to kindle a fire, and we quickly moved on to the topic of what I was going to be doing with the money that would soon be coming my way. I'll admit, when the day came for the doctor to collect the books, a cloud of regret had fallen over me. Despite the ludicrous amount of money that he was offering, I felt somewhat reluctant to part with my uncle's collection. These feelings, no doubt, however, were quickly dispelled as a series of brisk rapping penetrated the quiet of my usual afternoon routine, and I opened my front door to welcome my visitor. Mr. Glass had appeared wholly shocking and disturbing to me. Despite my familiarity with the grotesque and misshapen, he was both painfully thin and shockingly tall. Despite being bent over at the shoulder, he still towered over me by a clear foot. He had the complexion of a fresh corpse, blood drained and transparent, while his head was crowned with a thick head of bushy hair, raven black despite his obvious advanced age. His clothes, too, were as distinct as the man himself, for he clearly dressed in a manner of a gentleman many decades removed from the current age we occupied. These fine clothes were, however, somewhat lost on the man, as his hollow-like frame caused them to hang off him like folds of dark, dead skin. This scarecrow of a man stood at my threshold, nodded, and extended a withered, crinkled hand which I met, almost in a trace with my own. I tried my best not to be repulsed by the doctor's winter-cold skin and long nails as our hands clasped, but I fear that a modicum of my discomfort must have been made apparent to the man, as a cruel smirk broke across his features as I stepped aside to let him in. I watched as the vampiric form of the doctor entered my home, and another wave of anxiety washed over me, for the man who I had just invited into my house was so far removed from what I imagined a cultivated millionaire scholar to look like that I fancied a cruel hoax being played upon me. I had already prepared the collection, and they stood on a table in my living room, wrapped in brown paper and string. Upon seeing the pile, the doctor turned to me with his pale gray eyes and spoke to me in a voice so frail and hollow that I had to strain to hear the shriveled syllables that emitted faintly from his thin lips.
"Would you mind, sir, if I took the liberty of confirming the contents of those packages?"
I nodded automatically, as if hypnotized by the man's voice, and watched in fright as he glided over to the table and used his long, gnarled talons to cleanly remove the brown paper, barring him from the prize that lay underneath. I watched the grim spectacle of the doctor using his sharp nails like some kind of organic letter opener, and then greedily scooping up the books in his hands, flicking through their contents with the hungry gaze of a wild predator. Happy with this lot, he turned to me, and without even looking me in the eye, withdrew a folded check from his waistcoat pocket and handed it to me. I unfolded it, and was once again taken aback by the amount written upon it along with my name, and quickly placed it in the top drawer of my study desk with an obvious, avaricious celerity. Our business seemingly concluded, I regained my senses and offered the doctor some refreshment, which he took thankfully, as he singled out a seat in my lounge with great effort, lowering his mummified body down onto it. As I poured us both a cup of tea, he continued to plumb through his new acquisitions with a look of pure joy. It was a look that seemed out of place, and it was disturbing to see it grow upon his cold, rigid face. We talked at length for several hours, during which time he made several inquiries as to where I had acquired my collection, and I felt that he was trying his best to gauge just how much I knew about it. Being one of the world's worst liars, I couldn't bring myself to deceive the man who had given me such a huge fortune for some old books, and decided instead to tell him exactly where I had acquired the collection. I told him about my uncle, the Marsh family, and our Innsmouth origins, along with the legends surrounding the gunner's cloth and the horrible fates that had befallen several of Barton's children, the latter of which he did not seem entirely ignorant of, and he listened with interest as I reeled off the collection of even stranger relics that still sat waiting in my cellar to be catalogued. Upon hearing this, the doctor set aside his tea and asked politely if he could be permitted to look over these objects. As being knowledgeable of such things, he could quite possibly put me in contact with several antiquarians of his acquaintance, who might be interested in purchasing them from me. I saw little reason to deny the man who had so generously secured my fortune and helped to lead him gently down into my cellar by one of his spindly arms. Upon reaching the bottom of the creaking stairs that adjoined the cellar to my house, I stood back as he picked through the objects like a carrion crow, looking for the juiciest parts of a rotted corpse. He ignored most of the artifacts before him, picking up several crystals and tossing them back dismissively before making his way to the back of the cellar, where, covered in a dusty sheet, there stood a tall object that I had yet to bother with, and which he revealed in one dramatic and swift, sharp tug of the sheet. As the dirty, grayed sheet fell to the ground, the spectacle before us caused us both to pause, slack-jawed, before its horrid resplendence. For resting gently against the wall, there stood an object so magnificent and terrifying that neither of us could barely speak a word for several minutes, frozen as we were in complete awe. It was a mirror that stood some 7 feet tall and 3 feet wide, a perfect rectangle that was framed by the most amazing display of carved golden creatures, the likes of which I had never seen. The frame was a collection of fish, crustaceans, octopods, and amphibians, all carved beautifully out of a spectral white gold. At either end of the mirror, there sat a large carving of what at first appeared to be a mermaid and merman. But on closer inspection, the faces of these characters were not fully human, being instead a horrible amalgamation of fish, frog, octopus, and man. They danced and frolicked along the mirror's edge in such a vivid manner that they appeared to sway, as if caught in an invisible breeze, causing my head to spin slightly if I looked upon them for too long. The mirror itself was equally bizarre. A green-blue tint was washed over the glass, and even in the dim light of the cellar, it was obvious that it did not fully reflect the room back at us. Instead, it distorted our reflections in a wavy, sloshing manner that made it appear like we were instead looking upon our faces from a murky pond or pool. The doctor stood forward and ran his hands over the golden frame, and then shockingly, he gripped the tail of one of the carved mermen and with great ease simply bent it and pulled it off. The metal fin he then worked over in his hands, rubbing it between his fingers where it molded and distorted like clay, and not as any earthly metal should have. The plastic metal he then rolled into a ball and placed it in one of his pockets. He then bent down with a grimaced gesture and picked up the sheet to cover the mirror once more. He turned to me with clear concern etched over his gray face and suggested that we leave the cellar immediately and make for the lounge, where upon sitting himself back down, he requested some fresh tea and bid me to sit with him. The doctor then proceeded to tell me such a fantastic and macabre story that I became dazed, swooning on occasion at the strange mysteries he was inducting me into. He spoke as if my uncle's collection of books were factual, containing within them all the lore of mankind and the millions of years that had rolled on before our race made the slow climb down from the trees. He spoke of extraterrestrial invaders who once called Earth home, creatures that had seeped down from the stars and held dominion over our world, while man's most distant ancestors were still billions of years from appearing on the cosmic stage. These dreadful beings, gods compared to humanity, had experimented with life and in accident had given birth to the ancestors of the human race. He spoke of the elder things, the old ones, the dreaded fungi of Yuggoth, as well as the great race of Yith, all visitors to our small and lonely blue planet. He spoke also of the few remnants of this horde mythology that could still be found swimming and plodding in the darkest reaches of our planet's oceans. This last point he spent much of his time elaborating upon, bringing out quotes and page references from the things of the water, uttering those unspeakable names I had once glanced over myself. Cthulhu, Dagon, Hydra, the last two of which had their images carved into the mirror's frame, represented by the frogfish things seated at either end of the disturbing object. A whole race separated from mankind, but also disgustingly intertwined with it, that lived undying in the dim reaches of the ocean bed, swimming through the slowly dissolving ruins of dead sunken cities where the sun's rays fail to penetrate through the salty gloom. He spoke of an ancient pact made with these deep ones that resulted in a mixed heritage of human and something, and of the twisted families of New England who carried this taint within their blood, the Marshes being but one. He spoke too about the mirror in my cellar, how occasionally the deep ones had made such a gift to the tribes of humans who had worshipped them and their old gods as a means of contacting the people below the waves, should they ever be needed in dire times or upon the approaching times of their disgusting, unholy rites. By the time the doctor had finished spinning his tale of antiquated horror, the hour had grown late, far too late for him to catch the last train back to London, and so, with a little reluctance, I assured him that a bed would be available for him in my guest room. He retired far before I did, as I found it difficult to sleep at all after hearing about the so-called Marsh taint and how it connected with the things written down centuries ago within the books my uncle had kept and adored. Was Uncle Marsh looking for something within those books? Was he looking for a cure to his condition, perhaps? Whatever he had uncovered from the tome, it had caused him to calmly walk beneath the waves of the freezing Irish Sea without so much as a second glance back at the life he once lived. I do not know exactly what time I had fallen asleep on the couch, a half-empty glass of brandy still cradled in my hand, but I was aware of what had stirred me from the depths of my slumber. It had been a crashing sound, like something heavy falling down, and it had greatly disturbed the silence of the house. Blinking the fatigue from my eyes, I immediately thought of the doctor and imagined, aged as he was, that he had left his bed in the night to make use of the facilities and had fallen in the dark. Dancing up the steps lightly, I found the door to my guest room opened wide, and upon inspection, no occupant within it. Indeed, the bed looked like he had not touched it at all. I continued my investigation, finding no one in any of the upper rooms. Hurrying back downstairs, I made for the kitchen and was greeted by a source of light emitting from under the door leading to the cellar. Pausing as I touched the door handle, I took a moment to collect my thoughts. Just what was the doctor doing down there? I quietly opened the door and winced as it made a light creaking noise. Whatever misdemeanor the doctor was performing within my home, I was eager to catch him at it red-handed and without excuse. As I slowly walked down those rickety wooden stairs, I noticed that the light coming from the cellar was not from the bulb I had fitted, but instead from the far corner, and that it was no ordinary light, but a curious green gold that bathed the various artifacts and boxes in a sick phantom glow. The scene that greeted me was at once mesmerizing and terrifying, for the glow appeared to come from the mirror itself, which was lying flat upon the floor and not up against the wall as we had left it. The light immediately began to wane as I drew closer, until it finally extinguished altogether, causing me to retreat to the stairs and turn on the electric light. As the orange bulb hummed into life, another scene invaded my senses and caused my heart to fly into a panic, as bundled up against the wall before me, there lay the doctor, his limbs stiff and his face frozen in an agonizing, bulgy-eyed fright. The doctor's lifeless hands were clawing at his own throat. A strange smell, like that of all the rotting debris found at the beach, penetrated the whole room, and with ultimate horror, I noticed a set of wet, inhuman footprints leading from where the mirror lay to where the doctor had expired. Carefully, I made my way down to the floor where the terrible prints lay. The water that composed them was thick and gluey, and possessed an awful stench of the sea that made bile rise in my throat. Suddenly, the mirror caught my eye. I saw the surface of it ripple like disturbed water, as if something had just decided to spy up upon me before quickly retreating. I must have then fainted, for the whole room around me slowly disappeared in a cloud of gray, and merciful oblivion took me away from the cellar, the doctor's corpse, the smell of rotting driftwood, and the odious presence of the mirror. Of course, an investigation was carried out by the local constabulary, who I had contacted as soon as my conscience had returned from whatever restful place I had been slumbering. I was deeply worried that I would come under suspicion of foul play, but upon hearing that the doctor was paying me close to £1 million for some antique books, a fortune I would no longer be getting due to a dispute with his estate that I later became embroiled in, I was cleared of any wrongdoing. It was ruled that the doctor had suffered a heart attack and died of natural causes while looking around in the dank of my cellar, for whatever the reason the police force decided to conjure up in their follow-up report. I did not mention the mirror, and lied when informing the police that the light of my cellar was on when I found the doctor's body. In truth, I had returned the mirror to its position, complete with a covered sheet before I had called the police, and had also taken the piece of gold from his pockets. I did this in order to deprive the police of a motive, but also because I simply had no desire for the mirror to come under anyone's scrutiny. Had I told a single living soul about the strange glowing and disgusting seaside stenches attached to the grisly scene in my cellar, I had no doubt I would have been carted away and given a new home at Byron House. Thankfully, I still had plenty of time left before returning to work, so I was able to come to terms with the loss of my dreams and ambitions that the doctor's money would have afforded me. It was particularly crushing to have had such a fortune laid before me, only to have it cruelly snatched away, seemingly by one of my uncle's possessions. I had purposefully kept the thought of the mirror and those dread footprints far out of my mind, but try as I might, they returned again and again to me, mainly at night when lost in the abysmal embrace of hypnos. Again and again the grotesque pantomime played out in my dreams, occasionally with extra details that had either been omitted from the original memory due to shock or added anew from the depths of my disturbed imagination. Sometimes the doctor was still on the cusp of life, spluttering out blood-drenched warnings and pointing to the mirror desperately in his last thrashing moments. Other times I witnessed the body slowly being dragged into the mirror as its glass surface splashed and rippled like water. Finally, on one terrible night, I had seen what I thought to be a huge, flabby claw sinking back into the surface of the mirror with deliberate, lugubrious intent. This dream sickness soon became an invading presence in my life, and even when the time came for me to return to work, I would often be so fatigued from the stress of my nightmares that I would finish work early or call in sick on the days after I had experienced a strong session of feverish, night-haunted imaginings. I consulted my family doctor, who simply dismissed the dream and prescribed me sleeping pills, which I soon discovered made my dreams more vivid, forcing me to discard them after just 2 nights. Desperate to starve off the nighttime illusions that plagued my dreams, I took to consuming copious amounts of black coffee and spending my nights sat in my garden smoking cigarettes. However, this too did little to alleviate my condition, as the glowing stars looking down on me took on a far more sinister meaning since my talk with the doctor, and I quickly grew fearful of their incessant twinkling. This period of restlessness lasted for nearly a month and resulted in me being fired from my job and losing what little human contact I had in my lonesome life. It was a regular visit from my mother, however, that brought me out of my malaise and sharpened my focus once more. I confided in her all those things Dr. Glass had told me on that fateful night and watched her face remain unchanged throughout the entire revelation. Not so much a revelation for her, I felt. Surprisingly, she said very little and simply made a comment while sipping a cup of tea in my garden, that such things had been said about the Marsh family for years, as well as cursed Innsmouth from whence our family came. She did admit that she knew very little of our family roots and had almost no contact with relatives. She had practically raised herself, and it was my uncle who cared for her and spent most of his waking hours with their decrepit parents before they died. She then casually reminded me that a Marsh had bought my grandparents' house not long after I had been left it in my uncle's will, and I realized that I could perhaps alleviate myself of my uncle's possessions in the hopes that it would calm my mind. A quick visit to Mr. Fisher, and I was furnished with the name Eli Marsh. some kind of distant cousin on my mother's side who had bought and moved into the rotting home my grandparents had dwelled within, and to which my uncle was left when they passed away. Not wishing to travel to Seascale on the chance that I would catch this relative at home, I instead sent a simple note detailing who I was, some details about Uncle Marsh's books, and a description of the mirror. I asked if he knew any other details of our family history that could help to shed some light on the strange occurrence that happened to Dr. Glass, and detailed the strange effects that the mirror had played out in my cellar that dreadful night. In response to my inquiry, a sparse letter arrived asking me to come visit him at my grandparents' home at my earliest convenience. I wasted little time heeding the summons and boarded the train to the nearest station to Eastwich towards Seascale the next day. At Eli's request, I had things of the water securely tucked away in a briefcase, along with as many of my uncle's notes as I could carry. The train journey was pleasant enough, with changeovers at Manchester Piccadilly and then Barrow-in-Furness. Despite the usual overcast weather of northwest England, the countryside was still an open beauty to behold, and I allowed myself a few hours of respite as I drank in the dark green essence of its untamed rolling hills and feral woodlands. Eventually, the scenery gave way to the various villages and towns that precipitated the train's arrival in Seascale. The greenery disappeared amidst the dull gray buildings and hotels of the seaside resort. Eli had no intention of meeting me at the station, and had instead given me instructions to call upon him at any time of the day at my grandparents' home. He had expressed a dislike of daylight, and I imagined that he too must be a victim of the sinister wasting disease that had afflicted my mother's parents in so gruesome a fashion. I had intended to make more of a day for myself in the town whilst visiting Eli, but the autumn clouds and light rain do little to vitalize a tourist's hunger, and after a short 30-minute stroll around and a lunch at one of the many seaside cafes, I instead decided to make my way straight to the house on Reed's Avenue and see exactly what light my distant cousin could shed upon the macabre conundrum that had made its way into my life. Reed's Avenue was a street crowded by various bed and breakfast establishments and other tall, narrow buildings, nothing more than a simple row of heartless Edwardian constructions that overlook the crumbling coastline and rolling sea. I paused several times and overlooked the beaches on my way, allowing myself to fantasize morbidly over my uncle's suicide and final moments. That plump, naked, flabby body making its way to the water's edge with as much momentum as its master could muster, and then a simple wade out to sea until his body finally gave in to the cold grip of the sea and sank beneath the water. The wind around the coast was particularly ferocious, and it not only chilled me, but also carried upon it the seaside stenches of rotting crustaceans and slimy rocks, an aroma that caused my nighttime terrors to resurface momentarily and persuaded me to finally move along and towards the home of Eli Marsh. The house was sandwiched in between two bed and breakfasts, a tall 3-story building painted in a washed-out white with a rusting iron fence crowning the outside. Every single window visible was either boarded up or concealed with thick curtains. It appeared that Eli was a man who valued his privacy. Some simple stones led up to the red-painted front door, the only source of color found on the entire building, but this was somewhat offset by the peeling paint that revealed a dull, cracked brown beneath. I was about to knock when I noticed a piece of card on the ground held in place by a bottle of milk that had most definitely soured. A short message, or more accurately, an order, was scribbled upon it in a poor but strangely familiar script. Folding up the card, I opened the front door, which was unlocked as per the note's description, and walked into the gloom of the narrow hallway. Like the outside, the interior of the home was much taller than it was wide, and the staircase presented before me appeared to lean oddly at the top, giving the illusion that the house was fatigued and resting upon its neighboring establishment for support. It was difficult to see much in the dark of the hallway. I tried to turn on the lights with a few flicks of the nearby switch, but to no avail. A doorway to my right led into what must have been a downstairs living room, and I proceeded to investigate. A bare wooden floor and not a scrap of furniture to be found. This, coupled with the thick sheets that had been crudely nailed into the window frame and were doing a superb job of keeping out the feeble light, was all the living room had to offer. I quickly established this was not a home, it was a mausoleum. I was about to enter another room leading off from the back of my current whereabouts, a kitchen perhaps, when a series of loud, sharp knocks startled me and immediately made me look upwards to the source of their location. I will admit freely that this disturbed me greatly, and I wondered if I had perhaps left reality behind and stumbled onto the pages of the apocryphal ghost story. I froze like a rabbit confronted by the sight of a predator and waited in silence to see what would happen next. Again, the thumps pierced the silence I stood within, but this time I followed their source and stood at the bottom of the staircase, its thin, decayed carpet doing a poor job of concealing the dry rot beneath. Whatever courage I summed up must have come from the realization that I was here to see a member of my own family, not some moaning spirit wrapped in chains, and I smiled to myself in an effort to banish away the fear that had coiled its way into my heart. Surprisingly, the stairs made little noise as I ascended them as quickly as possible, jumping 2 steps with my stride until I arrived at the landing. Several doors lay before me, but one was open, and from the room within, I could hear a series of low wheezes, and finally a sickly, wet cough. With more than a little reservation, I knocked and gently pushed the door inwards. What greeted me was similar to the downstairs, a bare floorboard underfoot and a covered-up window frame. Although that was not all to be found, as 2 chairs, large and crimson but covered in dust, had been placed in the center of the room, and sitting in one of them was a shadowy bundle of rags and worn clothing that at a second glance contained the body of a man. It gestured toward the vacant chair opposite, and I reluctantly obeyed, placing my briefcase down and taking off my hat. I could see very little underneath what I presumed to be my cousin's clothing. Even his face was concealed with a scarf and a flat cap balanced upon his somewhat misshapen head. Words issued forth from my host's mouth, impossible, liquid words that were punctuated with wet coughs and struggling breaths. There was movement beneath that scarf, but not the simple parting of lips. A series of movements from the neck area, a restless movement of something opening and closing to the rhythm of his speech. The only parts of his body visible to me were the eyes, huge bulging eyes that stared at me unblinking and with focused malice. These bloodshot globes were not so much sat within his head as leaking out of their sockets, some unseen force keeping their jelly from outright streaming down his face. Despite their obvious vulgarity, these repulsive gelatinous spheres were at once familiar and alien to me. The Marsh look was obviously something I knew all too well, but to see it in such an advanced state and close up horrified me to my core. It took me several moments to recognize the words Eli was forcing out of his mouth.
"Have you the book?"
He spoke, bandaged hands outstretched before me like a begging child. I nodded and picked up my case, clicking it open and passing him things of the water along with my uncle's notes. He produced a pencil and started to write on the back pages of my uncle's diary, checking over the tome for some kind of unspoken reference and occasionally looking up at me with his flowing frog-spawn eyes. As he finished whatever notes he had written, he handed the books back to me, and we both simultaneously jumped as another series of bangs issued forth from the room above us. He reached down to the side of his feet and produced a broom and lifted himself with great effort off the chair. With the bare end, he then struck the ceiling in response. I half fancied this some kind of coded message, for the series of strikes did not appear random, but some kind of perverse hidden code. When another set of bangs responded, this suspicion was confirmed. Eli, seemingly satisfied with this, waddled back to his seat and slung his body back down in a way that was also somehow sickeningly familiar to me. Leaning forward, far too close for my comfort, he pointed upwards with his hands and gave a simple explanation.
"You must forgive my sister. She has succumbed to our family's condition and is confined to her bed."
I think I gave a nervous smile and a few words of sympathy, but I was far too transfixed upon the awful fish oil smell that secreted from his breath with every word. Perhaps noticing my discomfort, he leaned backwards awkwardly into his seat.
"Sit, cousin, sit. We have much to discuss, and my time in this world is fleeting. No doubt you have a dozen maybe 100 questions dancing around that brain of yours. But you'll have to make do with what I tell you today. You got some answers from that doctor friend, or what does a stranger know of the affairs of a Marsh? Only a Marsh can help a Marsh. Maybe a Gilman or a Waite or hell's even an Elliot might be able to tell you what's in store for you. But you have me instead. I bet you're curious as to why our family left Innsmouth behind and came back to our ancestral home, aren't you? Well, you have those books. Books like this here, Things of the Water, to thank for that. Our great-granddaddy was a sorcerer, you see. Oh, you may laugh at such a thing, but I tell you, it's the truth. A great sorcerer who could conjure up all manner of gods from the sky and the sea and have the angels of Cthulhu answer his calls. Others grew fearful of the power he had. Other Marshes who had little power themselves and wanted his for themselves. Not interested in paying service to Dagon or Hydra or any other god. Grandaddy Marsh used the names of the Great Old Ones himself, without any priest of Dagon present. They forced him out, chased him and his Deep One bride out of Innsmouth along with their children and forbade them ever to return. Why didn't the Order of Dagon have him killed? Well, who knows? Maybe they feared his power. Maybe they thought old Dagon himself would come to collect his due on the traitor. But it never happened.
He paused momentarily to catch his breath, and I watched as he struggled for several minutes before continuing his horrid monologue.
The mirror could be another reason. Granddaddy had made the thing himself as a way to commune with the gods of the sea and to look in on his family who had made the change and swam beneath the waters outside of Innsmouth. Who knows what bargains he had made with the Deep Ones? I reckon Innsmouth folk and the Order feared another uprising like the one in 1846 should they act against him and just let him and his kin be. So to Seascale he came, where he kept his books and said his prayer spells to Dagon and Cthulhu every Hallows Mass and Valpurgis and carried on the Marsh line, making new deals with the Deep Ones through the mirror and bringing in other families to mix blood with them old sea devils. Oh, you'd be surprised by how many round these parts carry the blood of the Deep Ones in them, and how many make the change and swim to the depths of Yark and There to dance and frolic with Dagon in the dark. I'll be making that trip soon myself. Me and my sister will walk down to the water and keep on walking, just like your uncle, my daddy, did those years ago. I could see you looking more confused, cousin. Did you think that Sebastian Marsh had no kin other than you and your mother? He's a Marsh after all, and had to take a mate among the Deep Ones just like we all do. Just like your mother did. Your mother was already carrying you in her when she met that man calling himself your father on the beach all those years gone. You'll change, just like I'm changing, just like your uncle changed. Your mother doesn't seem to be making a change, but the blood of Dagon is stronger in our men, I guess. You just say those words I've written down in that book. You say them when and where it tells you to say them, and you'll get those answers you seek.
He said nothing more, and I waited for several minutes just in case fatigue had caused him to pause for breath, but he did not say anything more on the matter, perhaps knowing that what he had added to the diary was all I truly needed to know. As I pondered the last few months of my life, a series of horrid realizations began to creep over me, and I suddenly wished to be outside, away from the bundled menace before me. I managed to muster enough will to lift myself off the chair and pick up my belongings. He watched my every movement as I backed my way towards the door. As I slowly exited the room and began to descend the narrow staircase, one final sentence barked out at me from the obnoxious fish-stench room and chilled me.
Marsh blood is thick in your veins, cousin, and you'd best prepare yourself for the change.
These last words were met with more wheezing and coughing, but also a guttural and mocking laugh. And by the time I regained my senses, I was outside the house and underneath the gray clouds once more. I staggered back to the train station like a piece of debris caught in the breeze, and once the train was in full gallop back to Barton, I summoned up the courage to look over the additions Eli had made to the diary. The instructions were clear but also baffling, a ritual of sorts. I hoped, perhaps vainly, that following through on my cousin's scribblings would grant me some measure of peace and closure. Upon returning home, I started to make the necessary preparations for unearthing the truth about the Marsh look, gathering the notes and formula outlined in Eli's notes. I had no wish to visit the gunner's cloth, to walk beneath the wych elms as the silver light of the moon bathed all around me in a chilling glow, but I did. I had no desire either to stumble or struggle through the mud and filth of the woodland on All Hallows' Eve in the direction of my uncle's home, but this too I did. I had made all the preparations as instructed to me by Eli Marsh, whose handwriting had been so oddly similar to my uncle's. The mirror, Dagons Mirror, had been removed from my cellar and once again brought back to the crumbling cottage, placed on the floor of the largest room just as it had been on that dreadful night that still haunted my dreams. The significance of the moon and date had been clearly set down for me, although I had the option of waiting for Valpurgis night in April to work the old magic of Innsmouth. I simply could not wait that long for the truth. It had to be tonight. The moonlight was strong enough to illuminate my path to the cottage, but regardless, I brought along my torch and supplemented Luna's gaze with my own feeble cone of light. Through the blackness I shambled, making no effort to conceal my coming from the various woodland beasts who hunted during the hour of the wolf and beyond. I half fancied all manner of specters and phantoms awaiting me in the woods, the ghosts of little Maggie Hagan and Jamie Birtle, along with every other miserable soul claimed by the cloth formed before my vision, dancing in and out of my sight among the trees. Suddenly, the cottage came into view, a leaning, rotting husk that looked more like a disused garden shed than an actual home. Surrounded by leaning wych elms and sitting on a circle of black blasted earth, my uncle's home stood in defiance of the repugnant nature that desperately sought to reclaim the woodland structure. It was crowded with strange, diseased orange fungus and furry rugs of crawling moss. Insects gathered all around the cottage, feeding with indignity upon the fleshy pulp of clinging mushrooms, occasionally pulling themselves away to dance frantically within the illuminated cone of my torch. The entrance to the sagging structure was not barred, and I entered into the main room of the cottage and was immediately greeted by the golden mirror lying flat upon the decomposed floorboards. Above, a crude skylight had been lifted into the flat room. I say skylight, but it was nothing more than a trapdoor that opened readily and eagerly once the single rusted iron bolt that held it in place had been relieved from duty. The ceiling door swung open, creaking like a walking corpse, and eventually came to rest after swaying for a few seconds. A wash of moonlight came streaming through the opening and hit the mirror's surface. Rather than reflect off the glass, the light instead beamed directly into the mirror, drawn into it by some unseen force that then expanded the light, illuminating the whole cottage so much that my torch lay on the ground by my feet. I dropped to my knees in horrid awe and unconsciously crawled closer and closer to the mirror's glowing edge. Once more, the terrible forms of Father Dagon and Mother Hydra, carved in gold and glaring menacingly in my direction, came into view, and I hesitated slightly before finally resting my gaze upon the vision that had been patiently waiting for me. A vision hinted at by Dr. Glass and my cousin. A terrible legacy that even now must be swimming through my veins and transmuting my form with languid but irreversible taint. Had this been what Jamie Birtle had stumbled upon all those years ago? Had he seen the truth of Uncle Marsh's heritage and as a result suffered a mental breakdown caused by his feeble lizard brain rebuking the awful reality of the Marsh look? It is difficult for me to write down exactly what I saw in the mirror that night, but for the sake of all humanity and for those who will come after, I will try. By the time anyone finds and reads this, I will no longer be a resident of Barton. I will be changed, and at home among the briny depths and salt-soaked stones of the deepest gulfs of horror imaginable. For I kneeled perplexed, transfixed at the scene playing out before me in the ocean grotto, where the fish things frolicked and swayed amid cyclopean ruins, dancing blindly and madly to a silent alien beat. The fungoid, flabby creatures prostrated themselves before the eroded edifices of Father Dagon and Mother Hydra and to the colossal statue of Lord Cthulhu that towered over the whole sickly affair. Except the statue was not a statue. It was alive and moving, overseeing its baying subjects in their chaotic worship. A tentacular titan, pleased with the spectacle around it. They danced and copulated and tore each other to pieces as the assembly reached such hideous heights of frenzy that I was sure I would be sucked through the mirror and into the icy salt water of Yunthale. But this disgusting pantomime being played out before my senses paled in horror compared to the realization that one of the creatures possessed a visage so familiar to me that I mercifully passed out as my mind recalled its likeness. For the newest addition to the throng of fish things wore the face of my uncle, Sebastian Marsh, he who sought the embrace of the Irish Sea, not in order to end his life, but instead to take his place among the deep ones, as all men who bear the Marsh name must one day do. The madness of the eyes is the lure of the abyss. Sirens lurk in the dark depths of the pupils as they lurk at the bottom of the sea. That I know for sure. Jean Lorraine, Monsieur de Faux. Hidden along the gloomy northwest coast of England, where the churning grey waters of the Irish Sea crash and break endlessly upon the ancient British sandstone, there can be found numerous isolated communities nestling in the lonely Cumbrian countryside. Many of these hamlets are little more than decaying farming communities maintained by clannish families who bear names that were still ancient when the first drops of ink were spilled onto the pages of the Domesday Book. One of the more prominent towns in Seascale, a former Victorian resort that has stubbornly dragged its feet towards modernity over the last century. Just 90 years ago, Seascale was little more than a collection of farms, but the Furness Railway Company had come along in 1879 and connected Seascale to the larger port towns of Whitehaven in the north and the Barrow and Furness to the south. The natural beauty that surrounded Seascale was ripe for development, and the railway company put plans in motion to convert the sleepy hamlets and farms into a bustling seaside resort. The huge crowds never came, however, and only a few large buildings, one being the impressive Scafell Hotel that still stands today, had been constructed, though it sees fewer and fewer visitors each year. Most who come to Seascale were simply stopping by on their way to explore the beautiful valleys on their way to the Lake District, rather than the town itself. It was a little more than a convenience for travelers making their way to a more exciting part of the country. The Furness Railway Company had dissolved in the 20s, after which a few more rail firms then took over the lines, but these too dissolved, until nationalization brought them under the purview of the newly minted British Railways. The state-run railways quickly gained reputation for neglecting the north, focusing instead upon the vast network of lines that connected London to the rest of the south. When the lines started to be electrified, however, British Railways finally looked north and rolled out a plan to upgrade the lines from London to Liverpool, Crewe, and Manchester. The Cumbrian coastline was next, the last vital step in modernizing the tracks from London to Carlisle. I was working as an inspecting officer for the British Railways during the first, and so far, the last time I set my sights on Seascale. I had never heard of the town until my supervisor told me that I would be needed there to check up on the state of the lines. 2 weeks earlier, a team of workers had been sent ahead to start repairs, and I was needed to oversee the operation and make a report. British Railways wanted to roll out electronification as soon as possible, and Seascale was the next stop before the larger and more important Whitehaven. The line was indeed in dire need of restoration. I could almost feel the decay and rust as my rickety carriage rocked and swayed like a dying serpent as it reluctantly traveled north towards my destination. The squeal of the train's brakes pierced my ears as I gathered my belongings, causing them to ring briefly. And then, with one sudden jolt, the train stopped, rocketing me off my feet and sending me crashing to the carriage floor.
"A light here for Seascale."
The conductor almost half laughed as he saw me pick myself up from the floor and dust myself off.
"You okay, sir?"
He half-heartedly asked, a smirk still stretched beneath his yellowed, tobacco-stained mustache. I'll live," I replied, frowning. I had actually hurt myself quite badly, and I could just feel the inside of my trousers sticking to what must have been a bad scrape on my knee. I retrieved my hat and briefcase and hastily made my way off the train, pushing my way past the conductor and his sardonic grin. As I surveyed the gloomy station, I saw that I was the only passenger disembarking at Seascale. A half-dozen or so travelers had been waiting at the station to board the train, but I alone appeared to be the sole visitor to the town. I glanced behind me to see the Cumbrian coast and the thrashing waters of the Irish Sea that lay beyond it. From there, I could make out the famous Seascale Beach, popular tourist attraction in the summer, but at this time of year, at this time of day, it was nothing more than a loathsome stretch of clogging sands and brine-eroded stone. Around the beach, thick tufts of spiky grass jutted defiantly out of the sands. They swayed as I watched them dance in the sea breeze. But it was the waves that truly held me in the grip of fascination. Those foamy, writhing waves that ebbed and flowed eternally, crashing upon one another ceaselessly, each bearing the fury of Triton himself. There was something about those gray waves that at once called to and repelled something deep inside my soul. I stood there for several minutes, transfixed, before noticing that the wind gathering around me had brought with it all the hideous odors of the sea. Disgusted, I instantly pulled my jacket to my nose and left the lonely station behind. As I made my way towards town, I noticed the first heavy droplets of what would later become a furious storm strike the top of my hat as I hurriedly made my way up the station road. The sky was growing darker with every step, and I glanced upward once or twice to see the thick gray and greasy clouds converge in the heavens above me. The squawking of gulls echoed in the distance, and the first rumblings of thunder rolled through the air. The streets were mostly deserted, save for a few furtive figures who were hurriedly running to cover from the rain. As I reached the top of the road, I noticed a large church across the street to the left of me and a curious stone water tower to my right. My destination, however, was the Scafell Hotel, the largest and grandest of all the accommodations available in town. I had previously heard of the hotel, having been recommended to me by a young couple who made it their habit to stay there every year in the summer. Thankfully, the hotel was close to the station, and I managed to avoid the worst of the storm as it unleashed itself fully upon the town. The Scafell was a curious building, and not at all what I had expected when I had heard that it was a Victorian construction. It was an unassuming squat, a 2-story rectangle with a washed-out gray exterior. Another, larger red brick building was attached to the rear of the property, no doubt a later expansion on the original hotel. There were lights emanating from the downstairs windows, as well as several of the upper rooms. I could hear the sounds of people inside, no doubt enjoying themselves at the hotel bar. With the lashing rain threatening to soak me to the bone, I hastily opened the front door and stepped inside. A middle-aged man with a neat trimmed white beard was talking with several people whom I assumed were other guests. I removed my hat and coat and gave my boots a good wiping on the thick, bristly doormat. By the time I had removed the worst of the dirt from them, the man had finished his conversation and was smiling at me expectantly. I returned his smile with a weak one of my own and walked towards the reception.
Hell of a day, isn't it?
He said, gesturing at the torrential downpour that was hammering the windows outside. Indeed, I replied. I think I managed to avoid the worst of it, but it still gave me a good soaking. He nodded before continuing.
I have a towel behind here somewhere, I think.
He bent down and started to rummage beneath the counter before returning with a sandy-colored towel, which he offered me with another smile. Oh, that's very kind of you, I said, dabbling the towel on the back of my hair and on the shoulders where the rain had soaked through to my suit.
You'll be from the university then, will you, young fella? Well, don't fret. We've still got plenty of rooms left.
University? I replied, confused. I'm not from the university, I'm afraid. I'm with the British Railways. I come to look at your tracks.
Oh, I'm sorry, sir. I thought you were one of those academics come to help out with the excavations and all. We've had a lot of them come to town in the last few weeks from all over Cumbria.
Some kind of discovery? I asked, handing the towel back to him.
Oh, you could say that, sir. To be honest, not a year goes by that they don't find something buried in the ground around here. Romans, Saxons, Vikings, we've had our share of visitors to these shores. This one's got 'em all worked up, mind you. Gold, they're saying. Some sort of buried treasure by the beach. I walked down yesterday and happened to take a glance at what they were digging up. It don't look like any gold I've ever seen. It's sort of white, silvery. Maybe it's silver or platinum or heaven knows what. Oh, but never mind my ramblings. Railway, you said?
Yes, that's right. I'm an inspector for the lines. They're looking at expanding electrification on the Cumbrian coast. I've come to see how the lines look and see that the necessary repairs are done.
Ah, that'll explain the workmen. I did wonder what they were up to at the station.
I hope they've been behaving themselves. I smiled. I didn't see them when I got off the train, but with a day like today, I assume the foreman ordered them to pack up and wait out the storm.
That'll be the lion. I think I spotted a few of them enjoying a couple of pints of old Fred's mild. It's not a bad drop, mind you, but not as good as the casket ales we've got on here at our bar, sir, let me tell you.
A brief but awkward moment of silence passed between us before he spoke again.
Ah, but listen to me twittering on like an old fishwife. You'll be wanting a room, no doubt. As I say, we do have space, what with it being off-season. How many nights would you be wanting, sir?
I should think no more than 5 nights. Though, if this weather continues, I may be here for a while longer.
Oh, it'll pass, sir, I'm sure. Now, 5 nights, let me see. That'll be £2.10. Board isn't included, but you'll find a lovely selection of food and drink on offer in the bar, or if you prefer, I know a good few local places you can eat.
To be honest, I said, pulling out my wallet, after the train journey I've just had, I think a comfy bed is all I want for now. As I said this, my wallet slipped from my grasp, sending a small collection of shillings and half-crowns and pennies scattering across the floor. Damn, I said as I bent down to pick up the coins.
Not to worry, sir, I'll get the register book sorted out for you.
He produced a large red leather tome and opened it on the desk. Pulling out a pencil from his jacket pocket, he licked the lead tip and looked at me as I struggled to reach a shilling that had wedged itself under the reception desk.
I'll fill in the particulars for you, sir. Oh, I'm Ted, by the way. Ted Slater. Now, what name is it?
Marsh, I replied with a strain as the shilling finally relented and found its way back into my hand. Howard Marsh.
Marsh?
He said, the smile swiftly fading from his face. His brows were furrowed now, and there was an almost accusatory tone to his follow-up question.
You visiting family in town?
No, I replied with a half laugh. What do you mean?
Oh, it's just there's a few Marshes who make their home in Seascale, mostly down by the seafront. You don't look much like a Marsh to me, and you seem like a nice fella, so I'm sure they're no kin of yours. It's just that, well, between you and me, the name Marsh isn't spoken of highly around these parts.
The old man had piqued my interest now. I knew only a few Marshes in my home county of Kent, but the name was rare enough that I had never encountered it in all my years traveling across Britain. Are they that bad?
Well, they're queer people, if you don't mind me saying, sir. I'm not one to talk idle gossip about other folks, but the Marshes ain't like any other folk in town. Keep to themselves mostly, probably for the best. Most are awful to look at. They age quickly, and those eyes of theirs don't seem too keen on confining themselves to their sockets. Huge, bulbous things they are. Makes them look like a toad or a cod or something. Surly too, and miserable. Most folk would rather cross the street than risk talking with one of them, and that's on the rare occasion they ever leave the house. I can only think of a couple that's spotted on a regular basis. Old Eli Marsh and his sister Mary. Come to think of it, I've not seen either of them for a few months now. Some folk whisper that Mary is actually Eli's wife and not his sister. But from my experience, sir, some of the families round here don't bother to make that distinction.
He shut the guest book with a large thud that caused a small cloud of dust to rise up from the reception table before placing it back where he had found it. Then he leaned forward, his elbows on the desk, and spoke in a slightly quieter tone.
Most of them are gone now. Not dead, mind you. A large part of the family upped sticks and went down south a few decades ago, somewhere near Manchester from what I hear. You just be careful, sir. Telling folk you're a Marsh isn't going to make you any friends in Seascale. Relation or no relation.
Well, thank you for the warning. As I say, I won't be in town for long. If everything is settled, I'd quite like to go to my room. There was a hesitation in the old man. He looked at me for a moment longer than I would care for, before returning and grabbing a key from the wall behind him. He placed it on the desk, his hand still covering it, and looked at me once more. I got a sense that he wanted to continue the conversation, though with a reluctance that I could not account for. Yes? I said, raising an eyebrow.
Forgive me, sir, but we did have another fella by the name of Marsh come by here a few years ago.
I said nothing, not wishing to interrupt the man and discourage him from continuing.
I can't recall his given name, but he was definitely a Marsh. We didn't speak too much. He wasn't one for chatter, but I got the sense that he knew the town well, almost as if he was a local himself. He certainly looked like a Marsh, if you understand me. All dry skin, big eyes, and thick lips. He only stayed the one night, mind, because...
He stumbled and swallowed hard before continuing.
Early one morning, before even I or the missus were up, he left the hotel and walked down to the beach. Some of the fishermen saw what he did next, and they said he stripped his clothes off and walked into the sea, naked as the day he was born. Vanished, they said. Didn't even try to swim, but sort of bobbed on the water, and then sank down below the waves. They never found him. No hide or hair of the fella. He must have drowned, I guess, but they never found the body.
I was unsure how best to respond to the strange story that had just been told to me. Certainly there are more expedient ways to end one's life, but who can say what logic persists in a mind so set on self-destruction? Instead, I simply sighed and made a weak attempt at saying what a tragedy it must have been to have a customer do such a thing, and that I hoped he wouldn't worry about me doing anything even remotely similar during my stay. He didn't seem at all sympathetic. He just nodded and released his hand from the key.
You have a nice stay, sir. Those beds upstairs are comfy and warm. Yours is the third door after the stairs, pretty much above me here in the reception.
With that, I picked up both my briefcase and the key and made my way to the staircase. I glanced into the bar area, which lay next to the stairs, past a double door of stained glass and brass frame. There were a few locals inside, drinking and playing what looked like dominoes. For a moment, I thought about heading inside and having a quick brandy to warm my bones, but decided against it. I thought about what Ted had said about the Marsh name and thought it best to leave them to their ale and their game. If anyone found out my name was Marsh, the news would spread quickly. If my experience working in small towns and villages was anything to go by. Instead, I ascended the stairs, each step creaking hollowly with every foot I put forward. The room was indeed where Ted had said it would be, and I opened the oaken door with a heavy clunk from the iron key. Both the door and the key looked old. Probably originals from the hotel's early Victorian days, I mused as I walked into the room. If I was feeling generous, I would describe the room as cozy, but still wet from the rain, and with the graves on my knee now stinging. I instead thought of it as poky and cramped. The ceiling seemed a little too low and somewhat misshapen, with a sort of large dent on where the south and west walls meet. The rain was still pelting the windows, which seemed to be made of thinner glass than those in the foyer, amplifying the sound of the storm outside. There was little in the way of decoration, and the furnishing consisted of a single bed, a small writing desk with a chair, and a chest of drawers. These two appeared to be Victorian originals, as the same amount of stains and flecking confirmed upon closer inspection. Thankfully, the bed was as Ted described, and I sunk into the soft mattress as I sat down to tend to my knee. My trousers had unfortunately bonded with a sticky mess that was just forming a white liquid scab over the wound, and I was forced to peel it away, removing the repair work my body had started and causing it to bleed once more. It stung badly, and as I winced, the image of the train conductor's mocking face flashed before my eyes. "Pillock," I said aloud to myself. "I hope you have a miserable day." I pulled up my case to the bed and retrieved a small first aid kit, which I always carry with me. A quick, sharp sting of alcohol and plaster, and the knees started to settle back down. I finally laid back down in bed, sinking further onto the duvet. Though I was deeply fatigued from my journey, the relentless rain battering down upon the hotel refused to let up, and each time I felt myself falling into the embrace of hypnosis. The ceaseless pitter-patter brought me back to awful consciousness. Unable to fall asleep, I sat up to retrieve a pulp magazine from my case that I had purchased from a newsstand a few days earlier. That's when I noticed the discoloration on the wall above the chest of drawers. There was a distinct outline on the wall, a perfect rectangle around 12 by 20 inches. I could see a small, rusted hole a few inches above the top line. It was clear that a painting or picture must have hung there once. Strange, that wall wasn't repainted, I thought. On a hunch, I stood up and moved toward the drawers. Glancing down the back of the chest, I could clearly see that whatever picture had once graced the wall above had fallen down and was still there. Unable to reach it as it was, I instead grabbed the chest and pulled it forward. It made a loud grating sound against the polished floorboards, and I immediately thought that Ted, who was likely directly below me in the reception, would hear what I was doing. I paused for a few moments, expecting a knock at my door, but it never came. With enough room between the chest and wall to stretch my arm down, I grasped at the picture and retrieved it. It was upside down, but clearly a painting of some sort. Rotating it to its correct position, I was immediately struck with awe as both the painting's subject matter and the skill of the artist who had meticulously crafted it. It was a portrait of sorts, though the background appeared to depict a scene or diorama. The subject of the portrait was that of a beautiful woman, with alabaster skin, long raven black hair, and large green eyes that seemed almost wet to the touch. Such was the talent of the painter. She was striking, and there was a smile painted on her face that was subtle, if not a little sardonic. There was a palpable longing painted into those large emerald eyes that almost cried out to me from the canvas. I guess you could say that the piece was Gothic. and it brought to mind works such as The Lady of Shalott by John William Waterhouse, as well as Rossetti's Astarte Syriaca. The background of the piece appeared to show a storm at sea. Bolts of lightning and terrified gulls were painted in exquisite detail above large black waves that crashed down upon what appeared to be a sinking ship in the far distance. Some kind of ocean liner in distress. With the train and wind still howling outside my bedroom, the pictures in my hands seemed to come to life. Try as I might, I could not tear myself away from those eyes. There was something so familiar, so haunting about those eyes, almost as if I had seen them before in a vision or a dream. Eventually, I snatched my sight back from the woman and turned the picture around. The back was bare, but I could just make out light pencil markings in the bottom right corner. Angling the picture towards a meager light filtering into my window from the storm, I could just make out the following: Lavinia, John Pickman, 1905. Unsure as to what to do with the painting, I placed it back on the chest and positioned it so that it was standing and facing me. I'm not too ashamed to admit that I thought about putting it in my case, but decided against it. Still, it would look wonderful in my living room. I pondered, perhaps, Ted will sell it to me. I tried once more to get some sleep, and this time was successful. Whether it was because the storm had finally started to subdue or the fatigue had won its battle to hold me in its grip, I cannot say. The sleep, however, was far from restful. Though snatches of deep slumber came, they brought with them the most vivid and fantastic dreams. I dreamt of storms and of the sea. I dreamt of standing at the beach and watching those churning waves crawl towards me, enveloping me in their black embrace. Somewhere out in the briny waters, I thought I saw the woman from the painting. She was bobbing and splashing playfully in the waters, unconcerned with the storm around her, for she was of the sea and therefore unafraid of it. I stripped off my clothes in a mad fit of lust and desperation. I felt myself rush forward towards the waves, wading waist high in an effort to reach her. I called out her name, and she laughed in response. The waters grew deeper around me, and I could feel its icy chill crawl over my skin, pushing its way into my ears, my nose, and finally my mouth. With a terrible cold saltiness, the briny waves dragged me down. As I sank deep into the gloom of the waters, I could make out a terrible phantom glow emanating from beneath me. And then I saw those eyes, gleaming like jade idols in a nighted tomb. But as those eyes grew closer, I could see that they belonged to no woman, not even anything that could be described as a human being. Still dancing and swimming playfully was a terrible watery fiend, something halfway between a fish and a frog, with only the most rudimentary and anthropomorphic features. I screamed, and as I did, more salt water rushed down into my gullet, causing me to sink faster and closer to the terrible creature. I felt a slimy claw reach out and grab my ankle, pulling me down to meet the horrible entity. I shut my eyes tightly, unwilling to look into those glowing orbs any longer. That's when I felt something long and rubbery lash across my mouth. Images of tentacles and lampreys flashed into my mind, then suddenly, with a disgusting muscular strength, the unknown appendage forced its way into my screaming mouth and attached itself vice-like to my tongue. More salt filled my mouth, but this time it was mixed with the awful copper taste of blood. I screamed and opened my eyes, only to find my lips locked with those of Lavinia, who was human once more. The pain, fear, and confusion left my body, like the soul of a long-tormented prisoner fleeing its mortal coil. Her slender white arms embraced me, pushing herself against my chest as I placed my hands on her silky hips. She was naked. We both were now. And the thrashing of the waves and the churning of the sea and all the fury and doom of Poseidon's wrath was naught compared to the endlessness of that embrace. She moaned as our bodies became one and wrapped her long legs around my waist. Her hair swayed and ululated in the water around us both like a great black cloud of squid ink. Then, out of the water, came a deeper darkness. The seas around us dimmed and the lights below ceased their sparkling. She released me, before swimming away and fading from my sight, returning to the briny grotto from whence she had come, and she departed. I felt my lips part involuntarily to speak her name once more, Lavinia. I think it was the sounds of the gulls outside that awakened me. The shrieking and crying must have jolted me awake, and I winced as my eyes adjusted to the bright October sun that now streamed in through the windows and washed over me. I leaned down and grabbed my watch. 11:30. For God's sake. I had overslept. I quickly leapt out of bed and made for the adjoining bathroom. I had planned to check in with the foreman of the work team making rail repairs, but by the time I was ready, it was near lunch, and the workers would no doubt be making for the local bar. Not that I begrudged them in any way. I understood the simple needs of a working man, and as long as they don't consume enough to impair their work, I didn't have a problem with them having a lunchtime drink. As I finished grooming my hair and straightening my tie, I glanced over to the chest of drawers and laid my eyes once more upon the portrait. Strangely, the expression on Lavinia's face had shifted. To this day, I cannot say if it was a trick of the light or a mere misremembering, but at the time, I could have sworn that the smile on her face was a little wider than it had been the night before, a little sharper and less mocking. I approached the painting to get a better look, and as if possessed, I hastily grabbed it and placed it in my briefcase, unwilling to part from its company for even a few hours. I hurried down the stairs and strode through the foyer, determined to reach the lion before the work crew. But as I passed Ted, who was busy cleaning the counter, something made me break my stride, and I instead approached him. Upon seeing me, he smiled.
"Morning, Mr. Marsh,"
he exclaimed, wincing as the words left his mouth. He glanced around fervidly to see if anyone had heard him say my surname out loud, but happy that no one had, he continued.
"Oh, sorry about that, sir. Is there anything I can do for you? The breakfast is off at the bar, but I'm sure the missus could rustle you up some scrambled eggs and toast. Maybe a spot of bacon if you like."
"No, I'm fine. Thank you, Ted. I was just on my way to the Lion to meet up with the crew. I'll probably grab a bite there."
"No offense taken, sir, but if you change your mind, we have some fresh lobster that's just come in from this morning's haul. Plump and juicy."
He split his hands apart by a distance of around 12 inches, as if holding an invisible lobster out for me to see. I do like lobster," I said, putting my briefcase down. "Maybe for some supper later, once my business in town is settled. Actually, I was wondering if I could ask you something about my room."
"Is everything okay? I hope the bed was comfy. If not, I can always change the duvets over."
"No, everything's fine. It's the painting, the one of the woman. I found it behind the drawers in my room. I guess it used to hang on the wall. You wouldn't know anything about it, would you?" He looked at me with an expression I can only describe as suspicious.
"The painting? I thought that was long gone, sir. I assumed the previous guest had stolen it for a memento, or one of the cleaners had perhaps broken it and chucked it in the fire. But it's still there, you say? Well, I'll be damned."
"Do you know much about it?"
"In a manner of speaking, sir, yes I do."
He leaned in close again and dropped his voice to just above a whisper.
"You remember me telling you about that Marsh fellow who stayed here a few years back? The one who took a long walk down by the beach?"
I nodded. "Of course."
"Well, it was his. Brought him with him, I guess. Beautiful painting, mind. Not sure who the girl is. When I found out that he'd, gone, I didn't know what to do with it. So I hung it in the room, the one where he'd stayed. Seemed only right to mark his passing in some way. It's not like anyone ever came to proclaim it."
"He stayed in the room you gave me?" I replied, unable to hide what must have sounded like shock.
"Not on purpose, sir. That room is one of our most popular. It has an adjacent bathroom, not to mention a lovely view of this town. If you're not happy, I could swap you over to a different room."
"No, that's quite all right," I reassured him. "Just a strange coincidence, I guess. There's a name on the back of the picture, Lavinia, as well as the artist's signature, John Pickman."
"Pickman, huh?"
He cocked his head and thought for a few moments.
Well, there's a Pickman who lives down on the seafront. Ruberry Drive, if I'm remembering right. In one of the old cottages. Come to think of it, I think he's a painter.
That's interesting. I wonder if your previous Marsh visitor bought the painting from him. The date says 1905 on the back. He'd have to be very old to be the same Pickman.
He is, sir. Very old. Have to be in his late 80s, if not his 90s. Queer old duck mind. Wears an eye patch like you see in those pirate movies. He's not as strange as some of the folks around here, but he rarely leaves that cottage of his. You could sometimes catch him walking down by the beach, staring out across the waves. He's got no family, far as I know. If you ask me, and nobody has, I'd say he's not long for this world.
I stood silent for a few moments before making my excuses and leaving the hotel. The weather outside was the exact opposite of the day before, with an open blue sky and a bright autumn sun casting its golden hue over the town. The streets were naturally busier now that the rain had vanished, and a few locals greeted me with a smile as I passed them on the way to the line. With the light crashing of waves in the distance and the faint smell of fish and chips in the air, coupled with the general atmosphere of peace, I could finally understand what so many tourists saw in Seascale. The place must be idyllic in the summer. The bar was only a short walk away, on the counter of Gosford Road, and just as I had expected, I found the foreman and the rest of the railway crew sitting in the far corner, eating and drinking, with a few of them playing darts on the nearby board. The bar was smoky, but not as dingy as I had expected, and I made my way over to the workmen and introduced myself. The foreman, a heavy-set Yorkshire man with a thick red beard, introduced himself rather gruffly as Jack Ellis. The rest of the men were not so quick to give their names and continued with their games and drinking while I got myself up to speed with the work they had been carrying out before my arrival. I can't say any of them were best pleased to see an inspector from the British Railways, but I assured them that I wasn't there to monitor their behavior or stifle their work in any way. All that I asked for was a report at the end of the day from the foreman, who, as far as the rest of them were concerned, was still the boss. Just a simple chat about the day's work and the state of the lines, along with any major repair work needed, were all I required from him. We could even have the conversation in the bar if he liked. This seemed to placate him and the others, and rather than hang around and have lunch at the bar, I decided it was best to give them their space, lest they see me as an unwelcome presence while they were off the clock. My stomach was grumbling furiously as I left the bar behind. Following my nose, I found myself at a nearby fish and chip shop and ordered myself rock, chips, and mushy peas for 1 shilling and 6 pence. I wolfed the meal down quickly as I made my way towards the beach, determined to enjoy a little sunshine before heading to the station. By the time the sea was in full view, I had finished the meal and threw the scrunched-up newspaper that it had been served in, discarding it in a nearby bin. It was then that I noticed him, a lone figure standing some 30 feet to my left. He was tall, strikingly so, and despite his obvious great age, he stood straight and proud and appeared to have no need for a walking stick. I could make out his hawkish face, with its wild and thick gray beard and full head of hair, both of which billowed in the light sea breeze. He stood, transfixed upon the waves, clearly lost in his own thoughts. I started to walk toward him, and almost as if he were aware of my presence, he turned to look at me, and I saw that a black eye patch lay stretched across his left eye. This, then, must be John Pickman, the painter. Unable to resist the urge, I approached him. He kept his one solitary blue eye fixed upon me as I neared, and as I grew closer, his back appeared to straighten even more. Before I knew it, he was towering over me. He must have stood well over 6 feet tall, and I suddenly felt very small as I reached him. He looked at me intensely, that singular eye burning into my soul. I struggled to speak, and when I did, it was a stuttered mess of confused syllables. John? John Pickman? I finally managed to spit out.
And what of it? What the hell do you want?
He barked back. My name is Howard Marsh. I'm staying at the Scafell.
Marsh? You don't look like any Marsh I ever saw.
So I've been told. I smiled weakly. I don't know if you're aware of this, but I found a painting of yours up at the hotel. I was wondering if you could tell me about it. He looked me up and down. disgust etched across his ancient and wrinkled face. I noticed his right hand tense and bunch into a fist, and I half fancied that he was about to strike me in the face, but his hand eventually relaxed. Then, with a dismissive sound, he turned and walked away from me. I instinctively started walking after him, unable to let the matter of the painting be. He noticed my following and spun around.
Bugger off!
He shouted at me, so loud that a few locals nearby turned to see what the fuss was about.
Leave me be, you Marsh devil! Haven't you lot had your fill of me?
He then strode off, faster than before. Please, I protested. I'm not a local Marsh. My family aren't even from Seascale. I'm with British Railways, here to look at the tracks. I just wanted to talk to you about the painting I found in the hotel, the one titled Lavinia. He froze in place at the mention of the name.
Liv,
He said, slowly turning to face me.
you saw my Liv.
Yes, I replied, relieved I'd gotten through to him. Well, I think so. The painting is of a woman with black hair and green eyes. There's a shipwreck in the background. In fact, I have it with me. I reached into my briefcase and produced the painting. His mouth opened, almost as if he was about to address the picture directly. His shoulders loosened, and I could see his straight iron frame soften. Suddenly, he didn't seem so tall or menacing. He looked like he was truly an old, tired man. I was wondering if you could tell me more about this picture, I said, holding it. It's incredible. I've never seen anything so beautiful in my life. Your artwork is astounding.
It was.
He whispered, still staring at the picture. I'm sorry if I've upset or disrespected you, Mr. Pickman. I just wanted to tell you how much I admire your painting. I'm hoping the hotel will let me buy it.
It's not theirs to sell. Looks like you've already claimed it. I assume the hotel doesn't know you took it. Besides, if you knew the story behind that picture and that harpy spread on the canvas, you'd leave me well alone, Marsh. But if it's a painting you want, I have dozens more at home. Why don't you come back with me? I'll pour us a drink and I'll tell you all about that sea witch you seem so fond of. Maybe then you'll drop the matter.
Without hesitation, I agreed, and we both briskly walked down the seafront together without exchanging another word. Pickman's home wasn't far. A quaint, whitewashed bungalow made of solid stone and thatched roof that looked like it was badly in need of repair. He pushed open the faded wooden gate, which protested with a loud creaking. The garden around the property was a tangled, feral mess. Whatever plants had once dwelled there had lost the battle with the tough grass, which must have blown in off the beach and taken root, strangling the life out of everything around it. We reached the front door to his home, but to my surprise, he did not pull out a key to unlock the door, but simply pushed it open. Aren't you worried about thieves? I asked, leaving your front door unlocked like that.
No one's got the stones to steal from me, lad,
He replied, somewhat ominously. The interior was dark. There was a haze of dust floating through the air. The smell of ancient tobacco clung to everything, and I could see that the walls were slowly turning yellow from what I imagined must have been decades of pipe smoke. Papers and debris covered every conceivable surface. My host shambled into what appeared to be an ancient kitchen, and I glanced around at the curious dwelling I now found myself in. As I explored, I happened to glance down at a bundle of crinkled newspapers sitting next to a pile of tea-stained cups. The date on the first paper was Tuesday, 21st, September 1926. This paper is older than me, I said with a chuckle.
I've got warts on my arse older than you, boy,
He barked back from the kitchen. I laughed. Despite his prickly nature, there was something endearing about the old codger. He reappeared from the kitchen with a tray, upon which he had placed a pot of tea, a jug of milk, and 2 cups of saucers.
I don't keep sugar,
He said, setting the tray down on a small table that lay between the 2 rolling chairs in front of the fireplace.
Bad for the teeth and bad for the heart. Sit down, lad. No point in being polite. Not with me, anyway.
I did as he said, choosing one of the dusty chairs. He almost threw the tray onto the table, causing the cups to clatter loudly.
I'll put us a fire on. It's a nice day outside, but this place doesn't catch much sun. In a few hours, it'll be colder than a witch's tit.
He proceeded to light the fire, which had already been prepared with kindling and logs. I took the opportunity to inspect my cup, which, to my surprise, was clean and free of stains. I reached for the teapot, but he shot me a look that froze me in place. After a few pokes of the flaming kindling, he reached for the teapot, pouring us both a cup.
It's a good tea, this. Strong. It's from Yorkshire. Gwen at the shop gets it in specially just for me. It'll do for now, but I'm already hankering after something a little bit more medicinal, if you catch my meaning.
He then proceeded to slurp his tea loudly, letting out a satisfied and setting the cup down. He then reached into his pocket and pulled out a long wooden pipe. As he lit the first match, the small flame briefly flared, illuminating his face, sitting there in the dark, taking languid pulls from the pipe. His hawkish features and mad beard conjures up images of sorcerers and wizards in my mind. I must have been staring because he shot me a look with his one eye over the rising pipe smoke and grinned.
So, you reckon you're not a Marsh? At least not one of our Marshes.
My family is from Kent, I replied, taking a sip of the tea. I've never really met any other Marshes, except for my close relatives, of course.
Any sailors in your family tree?
He asked, taking another pull from his pipe. It's funny you should ask that. My father was in the Navy, served during the Second War, and my grandfather was in the Merchant Navy before him.
Aye, thought as much. I'd wager there's salt water in your veins, Marsh. Best you not go digging too deep into that.
I didn't understand what he meant, but I decided not to press any further.
Now then, let's talk about this painting of mine. It's a long tale, lad. You best make yourself comfortable because by the time I'm finished, you won't ever want to set foot in Seascale again.
I shifted uncomfortably in my chair, but did not interrupt him. He then proceeded to tell me the most fantastic and horrifying story I had ever heard. Though his memory had clearly faded a little, his mind was sharp, and he was able to recount details from over 50 years ago and describe them with the most vivid imagery, making them seem as if they had just occurred only that very morning. At times, I dared to interject, either pushing him for more details on certain topics or reminding him of where he had left the story when pausing for more tea, or to light the pipe, or to take a swig from a bottle of dark rum he eventually produced from the kitchen. As he unveiled the horrid chain of events to me, the sun in the sky rapidly vanished, giving way to the night in a terrible, ferocious storm that quickly descended upon us. Those night hours were the worst, his story of horror and decay amplified 100-fold by the howling wind and the cataclysmic rumbling thunder and the heavy raindrops that hammered the windows of his home like rusty iron nails. By the time his story was finished, the morning sun had risen and neither of us had slept. I immediately took my leave and made for the next train leaving Seascale. Despite the day being clear and bright once more, I could not bring myself to look out at the beach or the seas beyond it, and instead made my way inland as quickly as I could. I did not bother to return to Scafell to recover my belongings, because the thought of being anywhere near that place caused a sudden dread to grip me. Upon returning to my branch office, I tendered my resignation and left the employment of British Railways for good. I had no desire to spend the next 3 years on the Cumbrian coast, helping with the government's plan to modernize the northern lines. I returned to my native Kent, and then after a few years relocated to London, where I remain to this day. In the long years that have passed since that day in Seascale, I have made several inquiries into the events described to me by John Pickman that have since added a terrible authenticity to certain details that I long thought too outlandish to have any base in reality.
It all started with that damned ship. If it weren't for that particular storm on that particular day, she'd have blown to another port or reached her destination, and we would have had our peace.
The ship in question was the Miskatonic, an ocean liner of the Blue Star Line bound for Dublin from Kingsport in the United States. She was modest, lacking many of the luxuries the other, more famous passenger ships offered, but she was famed for her great speed and had ferried countless Irish immigrants to the shores of America. No one was sure how she had come a cropper in the water, but whatever misfortune befell her was greatly aggravated by an unusual and uncharacteristically furious June-time storm. The call had gone out in the early hours of the morning that a ship was in trouble off the coast, and before too long, a large crowd of Seascale residents had assembled on the beach. There was talk among some of the more courageous men about taking out fishing vessels to pick up survivors, but they were wisely talked down by the more experienced seafarers. All that crowd could do was watch helplessly as the waves enveloped the ship and pulled her down into the depths. In less than an hour, she had vanished, taking nearly 1,200 souls with her. For whatever reason, the lifeboats had not been deployed, and for a brief, horrifying moment, the waves were dotted with men, women, and children, bobbing up and down helplessly in the water, only to be swallowed up one by the infinite nightened bliss of the Irish Sea. All anyone could do was pray and hope that whatever gods were listening would have mercy on the poor souls cast adrift. When the morning came and the seas calmed, the bodies started to be ejected onto the beach. Hundreds upon hundreds of bodies strewn across the sands and rocks for miles. It took days to clear them away, and months to identify the remains in order to notify relatives in the States. Many of the victims remained unknown, however, and were given a burial at St. Cuthbert's Church, in a special area of the cemetery set aside for them that the locals started to refer to as Neptune's Taken. Word reached the authorities that some bloated bodies had washed up as far north as Maryport, but a great deal were never recovered, forever claimed by the sea. There were wild reports that some of the bodies displayed signs of a shark attack, but this was immediately discredited. Every expert and layman of the sea agreed that no shark found in British waters could ever have been responsible for the terrible wounds that several of the victims had suffered. As dismissive as they had been, however, not one of these doubters was able to bring forward a convincing alternative theory that could explain why so many physical material was missing from many of the corpses. There also washed up various personal items and parts of the broken ship. Many containers were marked with the seal of the Marsh refinery out of Innsmouth, which later helped with identifying some of the victims, as well as the sole survivor of that terrible day. She was found on the beach, surrounded by the bodies of those less fortunate. At first, the rescuers mistook her for another corpse, for she was still and unmoving, face down in the gently lapping waters. Curiously, she was naked. For what reason, none could say. Perhaps she had the foresight to remove her clothes before going into the water, lest they assist the cold sea in dragging her down. Regardless, when a local fisherman removed his jacket in order to protect her modesty, she suddenly started to splutter, and the frantic call went out that a survivor had been found. Her existence was declared nothing less than a miracle, for she alone appeared to be the sole survivor of the 1,200 people thrown overboard, and many thought that her fortune was nothing less than divine providence. The fisherman who discovered her was Stephen Graham, a close friend of Pickman's, who was 28 years old at the time and visiting family in town. Stephen carried the half-conscious girl to Dr. Trenton, the local physician, who examined her for any signs of trauma or injury. Apart from a few cuts and bruises, however, she was unharmed. Her mind was not so fortunate, for the girl appeared to be suffering from shock and some form of amnesia. She knew her name, Lavinia Watley, soon to be Lavinia Marsh, and she was 20 years old, stating that her date of birth was November 10th, 1885. She could recall almost every detail of her life, with exception of how that final day aboard the ship had played out. She had traveled to Kingsport, Massachusetts, with her fiancé, Abner Marsh, the grandson of the famed Captain Obed Marsh and cousin to Barnabas, who now ran the Marsh Gold Refinery in the neighboring port of Innsmouth. The two had planned to relocate to Ireland and be wed in Dublin, though tragically this was now not to be. Abner, along with everybody else on board the Miskatonic, had been dragged into the watery fathoms of the Irish Sea, and like many of those poor souls, his body was never recovered. Dr. Trenton would later admit to those few locals whom he kept within his confidence that he found the girl to be evasive when questioned. Though she had done no wrong, she appeared to have an intense distrust of anyone in authority, and when government officials later attempted to speak with her about her and Abner's future plans, as well as their reasons for leaving Innsmouth, she would suddenly fall under the spell of amnesia in a manner that Dr. Trenton would describe as being obviously feigned. She also refused any help from the embassy to inform her family in Innsmouth of her survival, though she was powerless to stop them from contacting Abner's relatives. As the girl rested at the Trenton household, the cleanup on the beach continued. Police officers from around Cumbria, as well as hundreds of volunteers, assembled on the beachfront each day to look for bodies and to recover what they could from the wreck in order to be returned to the families of the dead. It was on one such morning, 3 days after the Miskatonic had been claimed by the waves, that a group of locals first stumbled upon the sinister article that would cause so much misery and terror to descend upon the residents of Seascale. The strange object in question had been boxed in a large, sturdy wooden crate, a sizable portion of which had been destroyed, most likely by being repeatedly thrust into the rocks by the foamy tide. That it did not lie at the bottom of the sea, strewn across the seabed with countless other articles, was odd enough, but it was the item's appearance that truly shocked the crowd that had assembled to watch several local strong-arms haul the thing out of the water. Once the lid of the crate was pried open, there lay an object inside so bizarre and spectral that none who saw it that day could claim in all honesty of having laid their eyes on anything resembling its ilk before or since. It was a large mirror. It lay some 7 feet long and 3 feet wide. Its polished surface was immaculate, without so much as a hair fracture upon its oddly greenish tinted exterior. Those who ventured closer swore that the thing did not reflect any object held in front of it, and those who leaned over to take a look could only find darkness cast upon the green crystal plate, which was framed by a strange menagerie of golden figures. The frame was especially lustrous, and at certain angles appeared more like silver in appearance than true gold. It was unaccountably light, and it could be shaped and molded without tools, as one man discovered when he nearly pulled away a chunk of the strange plastic metal while lifting it from its crate. The frame was decorated with a bewildering display of carved sea creatures. Octopi and crustaceans appeared to be the most populous beasts, but there was also several strange figures whose likeness bore no earthbound equivalent. They appeared to depict sea monsters or gods, half human and half fish-like frogs. They were depicted dancing and frolicking around the mirror in a horrid mockery of human gesticulations. Many of the locals were familiar with tales of mermaids and sirens, but even they failed to place the awful creatures into any known cycle of folklore or mythology. It wasn't until several years later, when Pickman had shown paintings he had made of the mirror to some salty old codgers visiting from Whitehaven, that the name Dagon became attached to the strange object. These old-timers, who in their long careers had visited every known heathen port in Asia and Africa, recognized the fish frogs from their dealings with the very specific tribes, and told Pickman that the thing must have been inherently evil if it was associated with the worship of that ancient sea devil. When Lavinia heard about the mirror, she was quick to lay claim upon it, stating that it was a family heirloom of the Marsh family and had been given to her and Abner as an engagement gift. There was no reason to doubt her claims, and given all she had lost in her fateful trip across the Atlantic, no one had the heart to contest or deny her claim. The mirror was moved to a room at the Scawfell Hotel and was joined by Olivia once she was well enough to move without aid. The hotel mistress, June Sockeld, had lost her husband a few years prior and had no children of her own. She took pity on the strange American girl and gave her a room at the hotel in exchange for some light duties around the property. Nobody knew exactly what Lavinia's plans were, and nobody wished to push the girl on the subject. A few months after the wreck, she had grown to become a fixture in the town and was typically seen walking to the various stores on errands for June. At other times, she was seen standing at the seafront, gazing out at the troubled waves longingly. Many of the townsfolk soon warmed to her, and the novelty of having an American in was something that kept the bar's gossip busy. Most who saw her agreed that she was a beauty second to none. Her long black hair, porcelain skin, and large green eyes were all that most men and boys in town could talk about. Despite her loss, it wasn't long before several suitors attempted to woo her, but she rejected them all. The only man she seemed to have eyes for was Stephen Graham, whom she appeared to have a great affection for. Only natural, many would say, seeing as he was the one who had found her on the beach that day. The two were often strolling together along the seafront, and Stephen would make up any excuse he could to visit the Scawfell, offering to help out with the various chores around the hotel. He was like any other man in town, besotted with the girl, and his friends, including Pickman, would often tease him at the bar over a few pints, jesting that he had fallen for a siren of the deep. When June decided to take him on permanently at the hotel as a sort of handyman, a rumor soon started to spread that he and Lavinia were sharing the same room. This marks the beginning of a gradual but steady decline in the favor that many of the townsfolk had shown towards the girl. As the weeks passed, some of her more peculiar characteristics started to grate upon the residents, especially the bedlams and old codgers, who are quick to find fault with the younger generation. A point of contention that was raised several times among the sewing circles was the girl's strong reluctance to attend church. She was absent from the funerals and vigils that were held at St. Cuthbert's for her drowned countrymen, but that was understandable, given that Dr. Trenton had advised that she rest up and avoid any potential source of stress, lest it further inhibit the recovery of her fragile memory. But now that she had healed and was apparently staying in Seascale, her absence from the Sunday service was starting to set tongues wagging across the town. Some thought that she may have belonged to some exotic American denomination, a Mormon perhaps, or an evangelical of a group not yet known in Britain. Regardless, she refused to take part in either the Anglican or Catholic services, and whenever broached about the finer details of her faith, she would utter vague allusions about transcendence and transformation that left many baffled and wishing they hadn't raised the subject. Life and death, she had said, were intrinsically lied together in an endless cycle that resembled the turning of the seasons, and it was not healthy to imagine either as distinct states of existence. When pressed further on these beliefs during a peculiarly heated exchange with the local Catholic priest, Father Hodgson, she simply smiled and said,
"No one truly dies, Father. They simply return."
Several of the old-timers declared that there was something distinctly pagan about the girl, though they failed to justify this claim with anything other than a vague collection of half-forgotten fairy stories and old wives' tales. The growing resentment towards the girl did nothing to dissuade Stephen from pursuing her, and as the two grew closer, the less Pickman saw of his friend. Stephen had once been a regular fixture at the local bar, was once becoming a rare visitor, and one that his former courtier friends was growing less and less happy to see. All agreed that there was something off about Stephen, though it was difficult to articulate just what it was that first started to repel others. Some of the locals reported that he could be seen muttering to himself while sitting alone in the corner of the bar. On other times, he would appear to be gripped in some form of mania and would start to preach the same strange talk about transformations that Lavinia was prone to sharing. His appearance, too, was starting to decline, his former youthfulness and vigor giving way to a fragileness usually reserved for someone several decades older. Great dark rings were forming under his once vibrant hazel eyes, and his skin was growing pale and transparent. On one occasion, he collapsed outside the newsagents, and Dr. Trenton had to be called out to attend him. The doctor had insisted that Stephen be transported by horse and coach to the hospital in Whitehaven, but he refused, and instead spent a few days at the local surgery to recover. Trenton, never one for maintaining the confidentiality of his patients, was heard telling others that Stephen's body had been covered in curious small circular wounds, as if punctured by dozens of tiny needles. These sparked all manner of rumors and gossip about his and Lavinia's private life. Pickman stated that he hadn't seen Stephen for at least 2 weeks before the incident, but took the opportunity to visit him at Trenton's surgery. He did this not only because he wished to check in on his friend, but because he knew that Lavinia would likely not be present, for Trenton had kept most visitors on a strict leash, only allowing one into the surgery at a time, and for no more than 30 minutes. Pickman described the terror state that Stephen appeared to be in, disheveled and exhausted, but still a marked improvement on how he had been before the collapse. Trenton assured that Stephen was on the mend, and his health would be restored with a few weeks of rest and hearty eating. It wasn't Stephen's physical condition that unnerved Pickman, however. It was his mental state. During his brief visit, Stephen talked incessantly about Lavinia. Had Pickman seen her? Was she talking with any other men in town while she was at the surgery? Where was she last seen in town, and so forth? Pickman quickly discerned that Stephen's inquiries were not born of any longing or concern, at least not for Lavinia, but of fear. Fear that he would soon be released by the doctor and once more fall under her spell.
I can't help myself. I know she isn't good for me, isn't good for this town, but it's those eyes, those beautiful eyes. They change color the longer you stare into them. Green as kelp one minute, then deep blue like the morning sky the next. Sometimes they're black, black as the dark ocean. I can feel myself drowning in those eyes. I can taste the salt of them as I sink down into their depths. I can't pull myself away. Those eyes, those beautiful, terrible eyes.
Pickman had called Dr. Trenton into the room once Stephen's ramblings started to break from a hushed whisper and erupt into a feverish babbling. A sedative was administered, and Pickman was told that it was best to leave Stephen to rest. Reluctant to leave his friend, Pickman had suggested that he stay and keep watch over Stephen, but Trenton did not budge and insisted that he leave the surgery, assuring him that he could come back and visit in the morning. It was the last time he would see his friend alive. The news traveled quickly the next morning. A body had been found at first light by fishermen preparing for the day's catch. The naked, pale thing found gently bobbing against the slimy beach rocks had once been Stephen Graham, but any resemblance it had once shared with the living man had been twisted and deformed in ways unaccountable. The corpse was quickly removed from the beach before a large crowd could gather to gawk, but the rumors of the terrible state that the body had been found in circulated rapidly. Some said that his eyes had been removed, but there was no sign of damage to the flesh around them, either by surgical or animal means. It was almost as if they had been sucked clean from their sockets. His face was distorted in an awful manner, so much so that all who had seen it agreed the expression upon it had no business being a human face. The nakedness was difficult to explain, and no clothing was ever found. The strange circular wounds that Trenton had discovered a few weeks earlier were scattered over the white flesh of Stephen's body. Most looked old, and some had even started to scar. But there were several that looked angrily red and fresh. One of the old codgers remarked that they looked similar to the marks left behind from a lamprey or hagfish bite, though the creature in question would have had to have been a large unknown specimen that had somehow managed to evade categorization by modern science. A funeral for Steve was held the following week in Whitehaven after Stephen's family had claimed the body and taken it back home. Many of the Seascale residents, who felt that Stephen was one of their own, made the journey north to see him shepherd into the cold ground of the cemetery at the St. Nicholas Church. Upon returning to Seascale, Pickman and the others held a private wake for their friends in the line, where they spent the night drinking, sharing memories of their departed friend, and cursing Lavinia. The girl had not bothered to attend the funeral, something that Pickman had begrudgingly admitted was likely for the best. Stephen's family had no idea that he had been entangled with the girl, and things being as they were back then, he had no wish to blacken their son's name with salacious gossip. Lavinia had been wise enough to keep to herself for the best part of a month since Stephen's death, but she was soon spotted around the town once more, often in the local bar where she attempted, unsuccessfully, to seduce several of Stephen's friends. Though still alluring, there had been a noticeable change in her appearance. Some said she was aging prematurely, with strands of silver appearing in her raven black hair, and the first signs of crow feet dancing around the outer corners of her eyes. None of this was the reason that the men of Seascale refused her, however. No. It was less about how she looked and more about how she looked at them. There had been a predatory cast to her face, coupled with a desperation that had mercifully acted as a deterrent. On several occasions, she had been successful, however, managing to corrupt a younger lad whose family had recently moved to town, and later a sailor visiting Seascale from Barrow and Furnace. But these were fleeting victories. The men of the town swiftly formed a group that kept watch for Lavinia and warned any visitors from speaking with her. The girl's behavior had grown so repugnant to the locals that she stopped leaving the Scafell, except for in the most extreme of circumstances. June, for whatever reasons, had refused to renounce the girl, and soon the most indecent rumors started to spread that Lavinia was offering herself to the male clientele who stayed at the hotel. The true horror of what had come to Seascale, however, was still to make itself known. The following spring, on May Eve, Henry and Margaret Spencer reported that their young son, Michael, had not returned home after leaving to pick up a fish supper for the family. The boy was only 10 years old, but he had been trusted to make the trip on several occasions. Not once had he ever given his parents cause for concern and mistrust. The boy's father, Henry, frantically ran through the streets of town, calling out for his son, while Margaret visited every mother to see if Michael had called upon their children. Henry was quickly joined by several other residents, who split up and formed small search parties to better locate the missing child. Once the town was thoroughly canvassed, the searchers turned their attention to the seafront and beach. The late spring sun lingered in the sky well past 9 p.m., but eventually it started its inevitable descent and submerged into the horizon of the Irish Sea, and soon torches were needed to continue the desperate hunt. The beach yielded no success, and there was talk of heading onto the moors in case the boy had wandered into them and become lost. However, the encroaching darkness made a search of the moors a futile endeavor, and with great reluctance, the search was called off until morning. At first light, word was sent to the other communities around Seascale, and police from neighboring towns joined in on the search, which expanded in scope beyond the town, with one party combing the coast to the north and south and another larger group heading inland towards the moors. Both of these groups became unnecessary, however, as the unfortunate news of a body being discovered inside a derelict farmhouse outside of town rapidly spread. The police were quick to secure the scene, but Henry Spencer, possessed as if the old Nick himself, sprinted to the farmhouse and barged his way inside, pushing the officers out of the way in a fit of hysterical strength. Inside that ancient and crumpled farmhouse, not too far from the fireplace, lay the body of young Michael. The howls of pain and rage that echoed forth from the devastated father were nothing less than inhuman. Once Henry had finally exhausted himself with his grief, the officers escorted him away. Margaret fared little better, becoming a shell of the woman she once was. The whole town turned out for the funeral, and the school was closed for several days. Most parents forbid their children from leaving the home near to or after dark, a measure that stayed in force for several months. Henry and Margaret separated a few years later, and both left Seascale, never to return. The town was shaken to its foundation by the tragedy, and strangers visiting Seascale soon discovered, and the locals were less than welcoming than they had once been, and many found themselves eyed with a deep suspicion. Few, if any, details about the condition of Michael's body were ever disclosed to the public. Officially, Dr. Trenton, then acting as the county coroner, ruled the death as uncertain, but in secret, he certainly had his suspicions. Pickman, who by now had harbored his own suspicions on the matter, confronted the doctor and managed to wrangle from him the terrible truth that Michael had drowned. How he had come to such a fate in a place so far from any large body of water was a mystery. Adding to the enigma was the fact that Michael had unmistakably drowned in salt water, as its presence was confirmed to be in the boy's lungs. Trenton had noticed that when he performed his autopsy, and while the scientific and medical justifications for such a conclusion were lost on Pickman, the doctor assured him that the boy had in fact drowned in the nearby sea. Why his body had been taken to the farmhouse was unknown. Certainly it had not made itself there unaided, and had likely been left there until the perpetrator could return to properly conceal it, either on the farmhouse grounds or more likely up on the moors. More disturbingly, Michael's body had also displayed the same curious circular wounds and injuries that had been present on Stephen's, and there was no single drop of blood left in the boy. Something had attached itself to him, pulled him down into the water, and sucked the life out of him. That was Trenton's theory, a theory only pulled from him after a few glasses of strong scotch.
Something had to be done.
Pickman growled at me as he recalled that terrible day.
I knew it was her, that she-devil from the sea. Me and some of the other fellas, we went on to the bobbies and told them what we knew. What the doctor had told me. Those marks on Stephen's body, same as on Michael's, how she drained the life out of both of them. But all they did was laugh and call us fools believing such nonsense. They laughed and threw us out of the station, told us to take our wild stories back to the pub and drown them in the booze in which we had dreamt them up.
Lavinia had rarely been seen since the boy's death. She had no cause to attend the funeral, and her absence from it had not caused anyone outside of Pickman's alliance any concern. In fact, beyond Pickman, Dr. Trenton, and a few others, it seemed as if the majority of Seascale residents failed to make any of the sinister connections between Lavinia and the deaths of Stephen Graham and Michael Spencer. And why would they? Most were ignorant of the similarities between the wounds on the bodies, and even if they were, who in the right mind would attribute such marks to a young woman? But Pickman was adamant that Lavinia had been the root cause of both deaths, and the police were unwilling to do anything about the great evil that now stalked the town. He was determined to do something about it himself. For the next few weeks, Pickman started to watch Lavinia, from a distance at first, but gradually he voluntarily decided to be drawn closer into her orbit, making sure he was present at the various stores that the girl would visit while running chores for June. He then started to frequent the public bar at the Scafell, giving up the line as his local drinking spot. A few of Pickman's friends who had started to vigil with him could not bring themselves to abandon the local pub. And so, by the time he started to drink at the Scafell, he was largely alone in his investigation. Only Dr. Trenton had stuck with him, joining Pickman for a brandy twice a week when both of them knew that Lavinia was present, working behind the bar. Pickman made a conscious effort to soften towards Lavinia, even going as far as to flirt with her on occasion. How much of this was truly an act is something that he claimed not to know, but whenever he spoke to her during this part of his story, he would stare into the distance, and a relaxed, enjoyed expression would creep across his otherwise stony face. He would catch himself as he grew misty-eyed talking about the girl, and do his best to reiterate what a vile sea harpy she was. But it was clear to me that he had once labored upon Lavinia's spell. Pickman was careful to note that Lavinia's previous bout of premature aging had mysteriously reverted, and by whatever methods available to her, the girl was youthful and beautiful once more. Pickman would watch on occasion as an out-of-towner staying at the Scawell would fall under her spell, and he soon learned the rumors that her entertaining guests were at least partially true. It is perhaps from jealousness that he decided to try and court the girl himself, though he took pains to explain that this was simply a ruse to uncover the truth about her involvement in the strange death of his friend. The closeness to which he felt towards Lavinia was rapid, and within a month or two they were engaged. This was of great shock to the rest of his friends, and to Trenton, all of which distanced themselves from him, but to Pickman this did not matter. So enraptured he was in both the girl and his quest that he failed to notice that his former comrades had turned on him. It was during this period of engagement that the horror finally occurred. It had caused Pickman to not only break off his engagement to the girl, but to flee Seascale altogether and keep his distance from the town of his birth for several decades. Once Europe became involved in the Great War, he was already signed on with the merchant navy and saw his fair share of horrors, all of which he claimed paled in comparison to that singular terror he had seen that fateful night in Scafell. After the war, he had settled in East England and found a job working in Scunthorpe at the steel mill. When World War II broke out, he was too old to serve in the Navy, but the mill became an important site for arms manufacturing, and he stayed on to do his part for king and country. He likely would have stayed there, but an accident at the mill had left him with only one eye, and the compensation offered to him had allowed him to retire early. For whatever reason, be it a nostalgic longing or a sense of closure, he had decided to return to Seascale. As Pickman neared the completion of narrating his long story to me, the storm outside had already passed, and the first rays of dawn were struggling to rise over the town. Though I had stayed awake the entire night listening to his account, fatigue had failed to find its hold over me, and I remained enraptured by his tale. Though I dreaded what was coming, I had no choice but to remain in his presence to hear the truth. The dream of Lavinia from the night before had been so real and so vivid, and his entire account had been so disturbingly affirming in its details that I felt hopelessly entwined within it. And so, I listened to him, listened to the final details that had caused him to abandon Seascale, just as I did as soon as his tale was finished, fleeing in a panic from that place with no intention of ever returning. The horror had come, Pickman said, with the disappearance of another child. This time an infant belonging to a young couple who had come to Seascale on vacation. Despite being outsiders, the townsfolk rallied around the couple, and everyone who could joined in on the search. Pickman could not recall the name of the baby or its parents, for he had left town on the very day the disappearance had occurred. This had, of course, cast a dark shadow over him, for a few of his former friends, bitter over how he had abandoned them in favor of Lavinia, were quick to make accusations, some of which have stuck to this day, making it clear to me why Pickman had such a strange reputation in town and many avoided him. But he cared little for this. He had seen the truth, and a lifetime of ostracization was little when compared to what he had seen that night. Before he revealed to me that final horror, he stood up abruptly from his chair, so much so that it shocked me and caused my heart to beat erratically. He left for the kitchen, and when he returned, it was not a tray of tea he was carrying, but a stack of canvases under both arms. Slowly, he placed them around the living room as he spoke, knocking off ornaments and various bric-a-brac as he slammed them down on the table, the chairs, the mantelpiece, and anywhere else they would fit. Each one had a crude replica of the painting I had brought him the day before, the painting I had found at Scafell. Upon each canvas, he had vainly tried to recapture Lavinia's likeness, but it was clear he was painting from memory, for although the subject of each was unmistakably obvious, each bore strange flaws and blemishes that caused them to pale before the original. When he was done, I found myself surrounded by the gleaming green eyes of over a dozen imitators, all arranged around me and staring at me with an intensity that made my head swoon.
"This is what I've been doing all these years I've been back, coward,"
he said, his one eye now wide and fixated upon me.
"The terrible truth is that, even though I dream of her nightly, her face fades from my memory. But the eyes, I always recall those eyes with horrid clarity. To think that even now, after all those years and all those horrid things she's done, I cannot escape her."
His voice was trembling with every word, and the threat of hysteria was slowly expanding as he continued.
"Once I heard about the child, it was as if the scales had finally dropped from my eyes. Maybe it was the Lord Almighty that had gave me the clarity. Maybe it was old Neptune himself was so fit to grant me the strength to confront one of his own fiends. Whatever it was, be it desperation, be it courage, be it madness, I raced to the Scafell after spending the day searching for the child with the other men of the town. It was dark like it is now. The sun was setting and the shadows were coming in to drown out all hope of finding the child. Into the Scafell I ran up those stairs and straight for Lavinia's chambers. It was then I seen the glow coming from under the door. A strange, sickly green glow, unlike anything I'd ever seen before or since. There were voices coming from beyond the door, Howard, but not voices like yours and mine. Slopping, wet voices. Words that spilled out of frog lips covered in salty slime and rotting kelp. Voices that sounded like a drowning sailor gurgling out his last prayers. Then I heard it. The moaning of a child. An infant cry beyond that door. In a fit, I kicked it down and raced inside. What did I see, Howard? If only my words could do the thing any justice. The glow was everywhere, bathing the room in its fathomless horror. She stood there, naked before it, before that mirror, the one she had been so quick to claim when it first washed up on the beach. But the reflection staring back at me from the surface of that blasphemous mirror with baleful fish-frog eyes was not that of Lavinia. It was something else. A terrible beast called up from the depths of lightless Rylya, where the fish things dance and hold court over countless eons. Oh, that's right, Howard. I done my reading once I left Seascale. I learned the terrible truth about the marshes and the haunted port of Innsmouth that spawned them. I know where she was from originally, Howard, and it wasn't any rotting town in New England. She's always walked among us, and she always will. In time, more marshes came to Seascale, and though no one ever saw her again, I knew that she was the fountain from which they sprung. Sebastian Marsh, that terrible devil, took up their work, said his prayer spells and kept vigil over those unholy nights when the fish frogs frolic. That briny bastard! How many more, Howard? How many more were taken? They're gone now, the Marshes, gone from Seascale. Hell knows where they ended up, but mark my words, Howard, she's still here. Still here in this town. Still out there in the depths of the sea, calling to any fool she thinks may answer. That mirror! I was frozen, unable to move. Those terrible eyes looking back at me from its watery surface. That terrible smirk etched across her face, and those eyes, so familiar yet so alien. I ran. God forgive me, I ran. How I would like to stand here and tell you I'm some kind of hero who put a stop to the evil of her. I can't. I ran, and I never looked back!
The man was frantic, gripped by a feverish rage. He wasn't even looking at me now. He was looking past me, out of the window of his cottage that faced the beach. Suddenly, he reached forward, grasping my shoulders with his claw-like hands and sinking them deep into my flesh.
You belong to her now, Howard. To Dagons Daughter. To that terrible goddess of the drowned and the deep. She'll come for you, just as she came for me, and for the countless others before. Oh, I've seen so many of them go in my time, Howard, dragged down into the salty gloom. Oh, that awful, panicked expression as they go. How they thrash, and they scream, and they gurgle, and they pray to every sea god and devil they can name, begging that just one will hear them and save their miserable soul. But it's all for naught, Howard. Despite the praying, and the pleading, and the screaming, up rises the Dread King's waves. And it's down into the briny depths you go. Only, you won't be dead, Howard, because you're a Marsh. You'll be living for eternity. Living, but you're wishing you was dead. Living with the awful fish frogs that were once your human kin. Your ma and papa and your great-granddaddy, he whom you thought was dead and rotting in the earth for decades. But he lives, Howard. Oh, how he lives! He dances and cavorts with his own forefathers, and his before his, and his before his!
He was screaming now. He pulled me up from my chair and pushed me backwards towards the front door of the cottage.
Get out, Howard! Leave this place while you still can! Leave it before it awakens the soul water in your blood, and you cannot resist its calling no more! Get out! Forget about her! Forget about Seascale! Erase this evening from your memory and go back home! Marry a pretty girl! One whose maiden name isn't Waite, or Waitley, or Bishop, or Gilman, or Elliot! Marry a pretty girl who's never seen the sea and never wishes to! Leave Howard before she comes for you! I never even told you the worst part of that dreaded night, did I? Tell you how, cradled in her white arms, she bore the mewing, crying and terrified form of that child. A babe, still fat and chubby from suckling on its mother's teat. She held the poor infant in her outstretched arms, and from out of the mirror that terrible fish phantom reached out and grabbed the child. Reached out, I say. For it wasn't Lavinia's reflection that stared back from the mirror. It was her husband. He whom we all thought had drowned in the bay that night. It was Abner. Abner Marsh. That bastard grandson of Obed. He did not drown when the Miskatonic went down, for he was never on board. He had made that trip back up to the depths long before Lavinia set foot aboard that accursed vessel. Followed her, he did. Followed that ship like a shark follows a bleeding sailor. She had brought him with her to Seascale, to feast upon the blood of Englishmen the way that they have feasted upon the blood of the Innsmouth folk. Cast out they had been, exiled from that crumbling place for crimes that even the Order of Dagon thought blasphemous. He was terrible, Howard. For all the scales and the fangs and the webbed hands, I could see the face of what was once a man staring out at me from that mirror. That was what looked back at me. A twisted son of Father Dagon and Mother Hydra. Grabbed the child, he did, and with one last cry for its mother, sucked it into the watery surface of the mirror.
He raised his hands to his face, tears streaming from his eyes.
Oh, how many went down into that mirror? How many to feed that beast? I could have stopped her, Howard, don't you understand? I knew what she was doing. But my lust for that porcelain skin and those chalky white thighs blinded me to the devilry she wrought upon this town. The blood of those lost souls is on my hands too!
He drew closer to me, so close that I could feel his rum-soaked breath on my face.
You want to know the terrible truth, Howard? Even after all these years and all that horror and all those drowned dead, if she called to me now, called to me this very instant, I would answer her. Go to her I would, and all this earth and these people and their puny lives would mean nothing to me. Dance and gamble I would, and I would live forever.
He started laughing hysterically and, pulling away from me, shouted his final command.
Go, you fool! Go!
And so I ran out of the cottage and up the street, Pickman's laughter still echoing from the darkness beyond his door. I ran straight for the Seascale train station. I can't recall if anyone reached out to me to ask why I was frantically sprinting through town, sweat pouring from me. I was fortunate enough to catch the first train leaving for Bar and Furnace, jumping on board and throwing myself down into a seat. I think I passed out because when I opened my eyes, I was far from Seascale, far from Pickman, and the terrible night of revelations. As I sat, waiting for the train to reach its destination, I then noticed that there was an object next to me on the train seat. Whether I had grabbed it myself as I fled from Pickman's cottage, or whether he had thrust it under my arm before I ran, I cannot say. For sitting on the seat next to me was Lavinia, at least in her painted form. The picture I had found in the Scafell, that very room where she had offered the blood of children to her inhuman husband, the room where Sebastian Marsh had stayed before returning to the sea. I still have it. It hangs in a secret corner of the attic that I keep hidden from my wife and children. I visit her every evening, after making excuses to my family. She is family too, after all. We speak, we dance, we talk of times that once were and will be again. The mirror.
I must find Dagons Mirror.
Gray rocks and grayer sea, and surf along the shore, and in my heart a name, my lips shall speak no more. Charles G.D. Roberts, Gray Rocks and Grayer Sea.
Gods curse you, Waitley! Curse you to Hades! Get back, you devils! Back, I say! Oh God! Oh Lord! Help my poor soul!
These were the final words of Howard Marsh, bellowed out in a feverish panic as he was dragged shrieking and pleading into the gloomy waters of the Irish Sea. To this day, I can hear them clearly in my mind, as if he were screaming into my ears at this very moment. They haunt my every waking hour, but are especially repugnant at night, when the encroaching darkness diminishes my other senses, delivering the horrid utterances with an abominable, maddening clarity. In dreams, too, I find no salvation, for Howard's words and his awful face, twisted with shock and rage, assault my slumbering mind nightly. I've not slept a full, restful night since I witnessed my friend's demise, snatched as he was from the jagged rocks beyond the lighthouse where we had met on that terrible night 5 years ago. The lighthouse is gone now, its brine-soaked masonry scattered across the seabed, and destined to slowly erode into pebbles, and then sand, and then finally nothing until it joins the abyssal fathoms that lurk deep beneath the waves. Though Howard Marsh's end has been of his own doing, pulled away from this earth by the very cosmic forces that he had once sought to embrace, I cannot help but pity him. For I am not convinced that his physical ruin erased all trace of the man, nor that of the other horror that had shared the lonely lighthouse with him. It is no simple endeavor to write an account of what I witnessed that forsaken night. My hands tremble with every vivid detail that I dare myself to recall, and what little courage remains in me is fragile and fleeting. I have tried every earthly prescription known to mankind in my quest to blot out that terrible night from my mind, especially the dreadful end that befell Howard Marsh, but nothing satisfies. Liquor does not help, it only makes things worse, bringing on fantastic dreams of things Howard had only hinted at during our final conversation. I had some success with morphine, but the White Lady's toll on mind and spirit only helps to erode away the memories I seek to retain while doing nothing to erase that evening of alien horror, in hopes that I can finally banish away the nightly terrors for good, as well as following the advice of Dr. Fleming at Byron House. I will now recount in full that lonely, wind-wrecked evening I shared with Howard Marsh in that doomed, crumbling edifice that was once the St. Michael's Lighthouse. I had known Howard for nigh on 2 decades before driving out to that lonely stretch of coast to see him. We had met on board the Lady Lenore, a rather poetic epithet for a dull North Sea oil rig, officially dubbed Ockfield Alpha by the Anglo and Nord Petroleum Company. I was Howard's senior back then, and I remember him as an energetic young man in his early 30s with a family. He was eager to learn the ropes of working on an oil rig and possessed an insatiable knowledge for all things. When not working, he would sit up in his bunk until the early hours, poring over historical texts and scratching down copious notes in his various journals. I will freely admit that during those early days, I could not stand the man.
and on more than one occasion, we had nearly come to blows over his incessant midnight scribblings. Eventually, I did soften towards him, and after a few conversations over a bottle of rum, I discovered we had more similarities than differences, both being keen lovers of history. I felt sorry for him as well. Life as the new face on board an oil rig can be hard, and it can take a while to adjust to being away from one's family. The other roughnecks teased him ceaselessly, ridiculing his appearance, in particular his large watery eyes, small ears, and thick wide lips. Despite this, he worked hard and was offered a promotion in a relatively short time. Our foreman, Alan Bishop, was a man not easily impressed by others, but even he took a shine to Howard and his strong work ethic. One of Bishop's many habits was that he refused to use given names, instead barking out Marsh and Whately whenever he needed our attention, which was frequent given that we were part of the electrical maintenance team. This amused Howard, who also took to calling me Whately and never by Doug, despite how many times I protested. Though he always displayed a diligence towards his work, I had the impression that Howard was more interested in the seas around the Lady Lenore than the rig itself, and I would often catch him staring out across the crashing waves while on the platform, or gazing out the window in our bunk room whenever a storm interrupted our schedule. He wasn't on the rig for long, working less than 18 months in total across several long stretches of service. I remember our final day working together. He had expressed an interest to return home and to be with his love, Lavinia, whom I took to be his wife and mother of his children. I was sad to see him go, and we exchanged details. He promised to write me as often as he could and kept me abreast of his future adventures. To give him his due, he kept his word, and every few weeks a letter from him would arrive from the mainland. I remember that first note distinctly, because I was taken aback by its contents. Howard told me that he had decided to join the Merchant Navy. Hardly a career for any man who had a longing to be by his family's side, I thought. He explained that his service aboard one of Great Britain's commercial vessels would afford him the opportunity to visit distant and exotic locations that he had always loved to see, including several islands in the South Seas that I had never heard of. After 5 years with the Merchant Navy, he informed me that he and his wife had sadly divorced, and that he had plans to immigrate to America, Massachusetts specifically. He explained that he had a family living on the East Coast, in particular in the towns of Kingsport and Innsmouth, and he had need of them to help unravel some mysteries in his own family tree that had so far evaded him. I lost contact with Howard not long after he left for the States, and to my great shame, had put him far from my mind once I returned from the rig and set up a small newspaper agents in my hometown of Barton in Cheshire to help see me through to my pension age. Compared to the rig, the work was easy, but painfully banal and dull. I would occasionally reminisce about my time on board the Lenore and look over old photographs of me, Howard, and the other lads. I did have an address for Howard, and on several occasions I started to pen a letter to him, but never managed to scribble more than a few lines before abandoning the endeavor. The more time that passed, the harder it became to write him, and so I resigned our time on the rig together as a fond memory and nothing more. As fate would have it, however, I unexpectedly received a letter from Howard, nearly 20 years since we had first met aboard the Lady Lenore. It arrived with the first post and was marked with a Cumbrian stamp depicting the beautiful green valleys of the Lake District. Opening the letter, I was at first quite shocked, not so much for its contents, but for the way in which it was presented. The handwriting was sloppy, childish even, and it took me several attempts to read the first few lines. It was a stark contrast to the elegant penmanship that was characteristic of Howard's past correspondences. Though I did not know it at the time, the words written down upon the crudely folded piece of paper would alter the course of my life forever and plunge me into an endless void from which I am yet to emerge. The letter from Howard Marsh reads as follows.
Whately, I hope this letter finds you in good health. I know we have not spoken for some years, and I apologize for my lack of due diligence to the friendship we once possessed. The offshore manager of the Lenore was kind enough to furnish me with your new address, and I am happy to see that you have returned to your home village. You spoke so fondly of Barton during our time on the Lenore, and I hope you are settled and happy. Interestingly, I had cause to visit the village a few years back. It is a cruel twist of fate that our paths did not cross then. but I believe you were still working aboard the rig at the time. The gunner's cloth was everything you told me it was, with its tangled briars and bramble-clogged streams. I could see why it has captured the imagination of so many of Barton's residents. I must say, however, that despite the sinister reputation you attributed to the cloth, I felt at peace as I strolled beneath the canopy of its wych elm trees. I am sorry to say that America did not work out quite as I had intended, and I returned to Britain some years ago, penniless and destitute. By some small shred of luck, I managed to secure a position as a wickie up north in Cumbria a few years ago, and have been working at the St. Michael's Lighthouse ever since. Unfortunately, we have recently received word that the lighthouse is due to be decommissioned and demolished next week. Apparently, the maintenance for such a remote tower has become too costly to justify. I was wondering if you would care to join me here at the lighthouse. We have much to catch up on, so how about we share a bottle of something and talk about all that has transpired since we last spoke? I greatly miss our friendship, and the memories of our time together on the Lenore are among the few happy ones I have left to keep me company on these damnable, long, and oppressively bleak nights. My last day will be this Sunday. Why don't you drive out here and join me? We can while away the evening with strong drink and talk of times past, and then head up to the tower to watch the sun rise one last time over the lighthouse. Yours, Howard Marsh. P.S. It would be remiss of me to not inform you of this, but I am afraid to say that during my time in America I have contracted a rare skin condition. Don't worry, it's not contagious in the least, simply a hereditary condition that has sadly been afflicted upon my family for many generations. If you do decide to visit, please do not be alarmed by my appearance. I remain the same man you worked with on board the Lenore.
Excited by the letter, I initially tried to call Howard and discuss his request over the telephone, but I quickly learned that there was no number listed for the lighthouse in any of the Cumbrian directories. Replying via letter was out of the question. As confident as I was in the Royal Mail, I had received Howard's letter on a Thursday morning, and getting a reply to him before the weekend was going to be very difficult. I soon learned that it was just as difficult to locate exactly where the lighthouse was on a map, and it was only by some small miracle that the local library in Eastwich had an updated National Road Index that listed as St. Michael's Island near to the town of Seascale in Cumbria. I say near, but the term was largely relative, as I soon discovered that the island was far from any town or village on the Cumbrian coast. Seascale was simply the closest, but even that was a good 20 miles to the south of the island by car. With no way to respond to Howard's letter, I decided it best to simply travel to St. Michael's Island and see if there was indeed a lighthouse there. The only other option would be to ignore Howard's request, but the thought of him sitting alone in that place, eagerly awaiting my arrival, only to be disappointed if I did not show, was unbearable. So, with the news agents left in the capable hands of a trusted employee, I set out in my car early Sunday morning and made the long trip north. The journey was pleasant enough, though the skies grew darker and more pendulous the further I traveled away from Cheshire. No doubt I was about to experience the stormy weather that the Cumbrian coast was famed for. On several occasions, I had to pull over in order to read the map I had brought with me, and it was during these times that I noticed just how nebulous the clouds above me were becoming. In a little time, my car's headlights had to be turned on to assist in illuminating the darkening country lanes that my map had assured me would lead to my destination. By the time the lashing Irish Sea finally came into view, the rain was hammering relentlessly on the roof of my car. The visibility in my fogged-up windscreen had also grown perilously limited, and so I slowed the car down to a crawl as it maneuvered around each twisting bend and tight curve in the road. After what felt like a lifetime of cautiously navigating my way forward, I spied the flashing white of a road sign up ahead, as my headlights swept feebly across the gloomy landscape. Slowing to a stop, I wound down the window, wincing as a barrage of cold rain pelted my eyes, and tried to make out what was written on the sign. Seascale, 2 miles. The sign was pointing towards a narrow road that snaked its way to my left and closer to the churning gray waters of the coast. With the maelstrom above me only threatening to grow worse, I decided a brief sojourn back to civilization would be welcomed. Not to mention, I could pick up a few sundries for Howard to enjoy when I finally did manage to join him at the lighthouse later. The town came into view quickly as I followed the road down and towards the sea. Large empty fields, constrained by hedges that were little more than a tangle of thorny briars, flanked either side of me, and through the downpour, I could make out the silhouettes of several crumbling and dilapidated properties, squatting along just beyond the neglected farmland. A small stone bridge appeared in the road ahead, and beyond this, several more houses could be seen. At first, the properties were spaced out, dotted on the left-hand side of the road, but as I drew closer upon the town, I could see more of them nestled together beyond a large sign that read, "Welcome to Seascale." The town itself was wholly unremarkable. Apart from the omnipresent sea and its crashing waves to my left, it did little to stand out from the hundreds of towns and villages I had visited across Britain. The storm had of course driven most of the locals out of the streets that bisected the houses and numerous B&Bs that faced the coast. Turning right and following a road that led to a small tunnel beneath a railway overbridge, I emerged on either side, finding a large stone hall looming to my right and a local church perched on a hillhawk in front of me. Passing the church and traveling towards what I guessed must be the town proper, I spied what looked like some kind of ongoing restoration project. A large, squat building appeared to be in the process of being torn down, though with the storm raging, the construction vehicles crowning the structure were naturally abandoned. It was a sad sight. Clearly, it had been a prominent and important building, but was now little more than a skeleton of rafters and beams, precariously held together by a husk of what little stone material endured. Passing by slowly, I could just make out a decayed sign still clinging stubbornly to one of the last remaining intact walls. It read, "Scawfell Hotel," in a flaking gold lettering. As I continued making my way to the town center, I could not banish the name Scawfell from my mind. I was convinced I had heard of such a place before, some residual memory or half-remembered conversation, perhaps. Scawfell. I rolled the word around in my mouth a few times to see if I could invoke some kind of reminiscence, but nothing came. The sight of a newsagent's and an adjoining sandwich shop up ahead quickly banished the hotel's ruins from my mind, however, and I pulled over eagerly, a sudden hunger gripping me as the various advertisements for homemade sandwiches and freshly baked pork pies beckoned. The woman behind the counter of the sandwich shop was friendly and pleasant, humming a tune to herself as she made me 2 large ham and cheese sandwiches. One for me and one for Howard, which she filled to the brim. The man working the counter at the newsagent's, whom I took to be her husband, was less gregarious and appeared to be annoyed at having to put his newspaper down to serve me when I placed my basket on the countertop. He lugubriously packed my items into a paper bag. I had learned from personal experience that working in a newsagent's is hardly an exciting career choice, but I prided myself on always greeting my customers with a smile and some small talk. Not this fellow, however.
Anything else?
He said. His words were impassioned and hollow. "A bottle of Island Gold."
Will that be all, sir?
He turned his head slightly downwards and glared at me through his bushy, furrowed eyebrows. "Oh yeah, that's everything, thank you," I said, pulling out a 20-pound note. "Actually, you wouldn't have happened to have heard of the St. Michael's Lighthouse, would you? Supposedly it's not too far from here."
The lighthouse? Aye, there's a lighthouse near here. Can't say I've had much call to visit there. It's out in the middle of nowhere. Why'd you ask?
I'm visiting a friend of mine who works there, Howard Marsh. Do you know him?
No, I don't. And I don't care to. If he's a Marsh, he's not welcome here.
How do you mean?
Let's just say when it comes to Marshes, I ain't got time for him. And we'll just leave it at that.
He handed me the change and nodded. "Well," I hesitated. "I'll be going," picking up my items and turning to leave.
You won't be getting to the lighthouse now,
He said, picking up his newspaper.
The tide's in. Won't be out again until, around 8 o'clock this evening by my reckoning.
I paused. Howard had said nothing to me about this in his letter. I had assumed the lighthouse simply stood on the coast.
It's what they call a tidal isle.
He continued, not bothering to look up from his paper.
There's a causeway that leads to it. You can only walk it when the tide's out, which at this time of year is either around 7 in the morning or at 8 at night.
I glanced at my watch. It was barely 1. 8 o'clock, you say? He nodded slowly. How long is this causeway? I inquired, with the realization that my meeting was now at the tide's mercy.
Not too long. I think it's just under a mile or so.
He flicked to the next page of his paper, a small smirk starting to creep across his lips. A mile? That's some distance. Is it safe? He slapped his newspaper down on the counter and stared directly at me for a few uncomfortable seconds before answering.
Should be, I guess. There's a handrail attached to it. Just make sure you use it. The causeway is bound to be slippery, especially in this weather.
He gestured outside at the torrential rain.
It's safer than it used to be anyway, now that it's covered in concrete.
Safer how?
Before they covered it, it was a natural crossing to the island, or so I've heard the old codgers around here say. The Devil's Spine, they used to call it back in the old days. I suppose it was like that in the Giant's Causeway they have an island. You know, the one they made out of the columns shaped like, what do you call them? Hexagons? I suppose it was like that.
That's interesting, I replied. The Devil's Spine? That's certainly a colorful name. How did it come to be called that, I wonder?
How the bugger should I know? Look, if you're that interested, there's a library uptown on Gosforth Road. Why don't you go there and ask? I got work to do.
With that, he packed up his paper once more and shambled through a doorway behind the counter, grumbling to himself as he did so. Glancing at my watch again, I do have quite some time on my hands before the low tide, I thought. The talk of the causeway had intrigued me. It sounded just like the kind of thing Howard would have written about in his journal. Perhaps a visit to the local library would help to whittle away a few hours at least. And if I could learn some more about the Devil's Spine, it would give me and Howard something to discuss. After all, my life had hardly been one of note since we last met. The rain outside was refusing to let up, so I quickly popped open the trunk of my car and threw the rum, cigars, and the rest inside before jumping back into the driver's seat. Gosforth Road was relatively close by, and had the weather been anything less than tumultuous, I would have cheerfully walked there. By car, the library took less than a minute to reach, and thankfully, the lights illuminating the interior confirmed that it was open to the public. Running inside, I found the smell of the building to be earthy, smoky almost, with the unmistakable aroma of ancient yellowed papers and aged leather. Like many libraries, it was deathly silent, and I quickly realized that apart from a young woman sitting at the front desk, I was the only soul inside. The gruff fellow at the store had given me enough to work with, and I busied myself stocking the shelves and browsing the card catalog, looking for any geographical or historical text that mentioned St. Michael's Island, the lighthouse, or the Devil's Spine. After an hour, I had managed to assemble a small pile of relevant texts, which I immediately started to skim through, in hopes of finding any crumbs of information on my selected topic. The young librarian, whose name I learned was Annabelle, was kind enough to bring me some coffee as I scoured through the assembled books, as well as point me towards other sources of information, such as the local newspaper archive. Within a few hours, I had managed to piece together a small spider's web of fragmented stories, folklore, and historical documentation centered upon the St. Michael's Lighthouse and the surrounding island. The earliest mention of the isle appeared in the Cumberland Packet paper from 1776, which contained a reference to an Anglican vicar named Frederick Cooper. The paper reported that throughout the latter half of the year, Cooper had delivered a series of fiery sermons at the St. James Church in Whitehaven that addressed reports of blasphemers said to be operating in and around the Devil's Spine. The sermon spoke of strange noises, dancing lights, and unholy pagan rites that several unknown residents of Cumberland had been engaging in whenever the tide was low enough to permit entry into the Devil's Spine and attached island, which at the time appeared to be named by the locals as the Witch Mound. The island's reputation was just as sinister as the Spine's, and from a tome dedicated to the geography of Cumberland, I learned that it once housed a curious arrangement of stone monoliths, not unlike those in Salisbury. These, however, appeared to be strange in their form. They were not hewn or smooth, but geometric columns, similar to the hexagonal shapes that formed the Devil's Spine, only reaching much greater heights and widths. All manner of myths, cycles, and local folklore were attached to these columns, but the most prevalent was the legend of Long Polly, a spectral hag who was said to haunt the stones with her disciples. Her coven was said to call upon a terrible black demon that lived beneath the isle, and there was talk of dark pacts and sacrifices made to the stones at the times of Walpurgis and Hallows Eve. Frederick Cooper had warned his congregation on numerous occasions to avoid trafficking with the wicked sprite of Long Polly and her hellish imps in his sermons, and he also condemned the use of pagan offerings made to false idols. In particular, he appeared to be greatly vexed by the locals' use of a heathen hieroglyph said to ward off evil and ask that his flock look to the Lord for their salvation from dark powers. There were later records of arrests made relating to these incidents, though the details were scarce and the names of the perpetrators and the outcomes of their arrests were not published, and no other account of them could be found. at least not in the text I had at hand. The only other mention of the Witch Mound spoke of a local legend recorded in 1906 by the anthropologist and antiquarian Sir Robert Shaw in his book titled Cumberland, Folklore and Devilry. Sir Robert had written of an account given to him by a seascale man who spoke of the strange noises that could occasionally be heard emanating from the rocks around the Witch Mound whenever the tide was out and the wind was strong. The sound was difficult to describe, for it resembled no known speech spoken in the region. Sir Robert had done his best to write down what the seascale man told him, recording the sinister sound as something resembling tekalili, though he took great pains to assure the reader that even these queer letters failed to truly capture the haunting and morbid essence of the sound as described to him. At some point, around a century after Frederick Cooper was first warned of the ill omens surrounding the island, the lighthouse had been commissioned and built upon the island, which had now been given the name St. Michael's. The stones must have been destroyed to make way for the lighthouse, and the Devil's Spine had reportedly been covered with steel-reinforced concrete around the same time. Apart from the strange whistling sound that could occasionally still be heard, no further reports of strange lights or devil worship persisted, and all later writings discussing the island and the lighthouse were painfully banal and mundane in scope. By the time I had finished my impromptu investigation, it was nearly 6 o'clock, and the sun had vanished, giving way to the chilling shadows that accompanied the growing autumnal darkness. The worst of the storm had mercifully passed, though it was still ferociously windy and hopelessly damp outside. With more than enough time to make it to the Devil's Spine for the low tide, I jumped once more into my car and made my way out to Seascale and back to the main road that led to the north. Though the rain had cleared, visibility was still poor due to the lack of street lamps beyond the town, and my feeble headlamps struggled to banish away the perpetual gloom that enveloped the lonely road ahead. Reading the map was even more difficult in the oppressive dimness, and I struggled to pinpoint exactly where I was as I wrestled with it and a small pocket flashlight I had brought for just such an occasion. I was about to pull over, but as my car crested a small hillock in the road, I suddenly spied the St. Michael's lighthouse casting its beacon across the churning waves. Relief washed over me. With the lighthouse's aid, I could easily reach my destination, and I tossed the map and flashlight aside. Arriving at the coast, I found a small patch of flattened earth that was slightly elevated from the road and that served nicely for a parking spot, and so I pulled the car in, facing the lighthouse directly. From my vantage point, I could see that the bulk of the causeway was still submerged by the thrashing waves, though for a brief moment I thought I could spy the very top of the gray concrete structure breaching the water on the side closest to the coast. It was around 7 o'clock, and assuming that the store clerk had been accurate with his tidal knowledge, I had an hour or so before the causeway emerged from the briny fathoms. The beacon's light swept across my car as it made its languid sojourn across the waters, illuminating everything briefly in a cold, pale glow before plunging me once more into the platonic depths of the lonely Cumbrian countryside. The signal from my radio offered little more than an incessant buzzing static, but I fiddled with the tuner in the vain hopes of finding something to help me pass the time. As I strained to hear through the hissing and crackling, I suddenly became aware of a sound beyond, something outside the car. It was faint and distant, and I fancied that I had imagined it when I wound my window down, only to be greeted by the billowing winds and crashing waves. I was about to dismiss the matter and return to the radio when I heard it again, a sort of whistling sound coming from the direction of the lighthouse. My mind struggled to form exactly what the sound was. It was almost like a voice whispering feebly into the night air. But there was a whimsical melancholy to it, and it was oppressively Stygian and lonesome. As I struggled to make sense of the odd notes, I felt a sudden rise in the air around me. It is difficult to truly describe, but it was almost as if the air around me was vibrating, ululating in unison to the whistle. I remembered Sir Robert's account of the Seascale man's encounter with the strange noises around the lighthouse, and that is when the words started to form before me in a horrid clarity. I cannot say if it was the sound that formed the words or the words that formed the sound, but it was unmistakable in its utterances. I felt a chilling dread grip my heart, freezing it momentarily, and I could feel the beginning of a panic creep over my skin. Then, suddenly and unexpectedly, another sound bellowed out into the night, drowning out the wind and the waves and the strange musical whisperings. I physically jumped, striking the top of my head on the frame of the window as it roared out once more. It was the lighthouse foghorn. It took me a few minutes to appreciate that, although shocking, the booming cacophony was wholly mundane in nature and did not warrant the alarm and panic that it briefly fostered upon me. What happened next, however, was remarkably abnormal. For almost as if in response to that second mournful dirge, the light of the beacon shifted in its composition, transforming from a pale white to a chalcedonic green hue that slowly deepened in tone to a dark emerald. Absurdly, despite the obvious dimming, the beacon continued to give off a glow on the very outer edges of the beam in a nimbus of pinks, oranges, and blues. I was struck with the paradoxical realization that the light was somehow both dazzlingly bright and unfathomably dark at the same time. The closest comparison I can put into words is the remarkable displays of the aurora borealis, with its shifting cosmic arcs and shimmering chromatic waves. After a few seconds, the bizarre display shifted once more, transforming into a cold green gold. I cannot say for how long I gazed at the light as it rotated slowly across the sea and the coast. By the time I managed to break its spell, I could see that the tide had fully retreated and the gray, slimy concrete of the causeway was now clearly visible and accessible. I wasted no time and grabbed my belongings from the trunk of the car. I have no idea what possessed me to take the next item from the glove box of my car, but I did so decidedly once I remembered that it was there. Be it paranoia or some unconscious awakening of survival instinct, but just as I was about to make my way towards the devil's spine, I quickly returned to my car and retrieved the revolver. The gun had once belonged to my grandfather, who had brought it back with him when the war ended and gifted it to my father, who in turn gave it to me. Something of a family heirloom that was quite illegal. I'd thought about handing it over to the police, but always decided against it. I had precious few memories of my grandfather, and this lone artifact was one of the few remaining pieces of him in my life. I had no idea if the thing even worked, but it was loaded with 6 brass shells, and the weight of the grip in my palm was reassuring. Making my way to the causeway, I soon learned that the small set of steps leading down towards it were hopelessly slick with a disgusting, briny sludge that I assumed must have been deposited by the retreating waves. The slime was omnipresent and slippery, and I was forced to hold my flashlight in my mouth so that I could at least grasp onto the railing that jutted precariously out of the concrete. I managed to slowly pull myself along the railing, despite the ferocious October winds battering me incessantly. Once or twice, I felt my feet slip on some horrid, jellied deposit, but I managed to stay steady as I progressed sluggishly forward and towards the sweeping beacon of the lighthouse. The whole scenario felt like a dream, as if I were trapped in one of those awful somnambulic shambles, where the dreamer is unable to run or even walk without expending a Herculean effort. As I lumbered across the path, I could just about make out the patterns of hexagonal shapes in the ground where the gray concrete had eroded and thinned from years of tidal scorings. I wondered how many more waves the concrete could withstand before great chunks of it fell away to reveal the antiqued horror of the devil's spine that lay beneath. Every few minutes, the sickly green-gold light of the beacon would wash over the causeway, briefly illuminating my way before plunging me once more into Stygian blackness. These times were the most dreadful, as the beacon brought not only light, but also the deep shadows of whatever it cast itself upon. I half fancied all manner of strange sea-dwelling creatures crawling across the exposed seabed. Disgusting crabs, floundering fish things, and strange jellies danced before my eyes whenever the light washed over me. The foghorn sounded again, causing me to physically jump in fright as its mournful dirge filled the air once more. Finally, after nearly 40 minutes of struggling against the wind, I eventually reached the island, where another set of steps leading upward greeted me. With one last burst of what little energy remained in my legs, I ascended them triumphantly. The island itself was small, with the lighthouse and adjacent stone cottage taking up the bulk of available space. Most of it was little more than black, jagged rocks with a few slick, cyclopean stones, which I half imagined to be remnants from the supposed hexagonal columns which once formed the witch mound mentioned in Sir Robert's book. There was little to nothing in the way of flora, except for an emaciated skeletal tree that stood alone, anemic and withered to the east of the island. A small oil lamp was attached to the wall of the cottage, its iron frame clanging against the gray slate from which the cottage was made. The adjacent door, which appeared to be crafted from little more than driftwood, was gnarled and decrepit and slightly ajar, banging and slamming against its frame. The light of the cottage appeared to be on, though the shutters had been pulled across the windows, obscuring whatever lay in the rooms beyond. Lashed by the winds and soaked to the bones, I wasted little time in approaching the door and entering the cottage. A small hallway with 2 doors on either side greeted me as I entered. A 5th door, at the far end of the hallway directly in front, was open, and beyond it I could see the spiral iron staircase, which I guessed must lead to the lighthouse tower. There was a coat rack crudely nailed to the wall on my left, with a few scattered coats, caps, and scarves piled on the hand-carved pegs. Beneath them lay 3 sets of large boots, all of which appeared to be mud-clogged and sodden. I wiped my own boots on the coarse burlap doormat, expecting my friend to hear me and come out to greet me. I heard nothing, however, save for the muted wind still billowing outside.
Howard?
I shouted into the deserted hallway.
Are you there, Marsh? It's Whately.
Nothing. Shrugging, I removed my boots and placed them next to the others. I also removed my soaked coat and hung it up on what little space remained on the rack. Not wishing to intrude, but also motivated by the possibility of a hot cup of coffee, I walked to the nearest door on the right, making sure my steps were loud and deliberate in hopes that my host would hear them. The room beyond was the bunk room, confirmed by the presence of 4 large wooden bed frames, each with a small chest positioned nearby for personal items. A small adjacent bathroom with a tin bath and an attached shower accounted for the next door. There was no toilet in the bathroom. The idea of braving the storm in order to make use of that particular facility did not appeal to me, so I made a lighthearted note to myself to take it easy on the rum I had brought. The doors on the other side opened into a combined kitchen, sitting room, and study. The kitchen was basic, consisting of little more than a stove and some cupboards. I placed my bag and sundries upon the counter, again deliberately and with intent to alert Howard to my presence. When only silence followed, I instead decided to boil some coffee in preparation for my host's eventual appearance. The sitting room was dark, but looked somewhat cozy and comfy, with several large chairs positioned against the far wall, with a log burner between them, which I was overjoyed to see was currently aflame and glowing with the lambent embers of several burning logs. Above the fire, I could see an old portrait depicting a beautiful woman with long, flowing black hair and deep green eyes. I neared closer to warm my hands and take a better look at the painting, but instead noticed a small folded-up note with Whately scribbled in pencil sitting on the mantelpiece waiting for me. I picked it up and unfolded it, greeted by the same atrocious handwriting I had seen in Howard's letter.
Make yourself at home. Making adjustments to the lens. Will be down shortly.
I had no way of knowing when the note had been written, but guessed that he had penned it sometime in the evening, knowing that I had missed the morning's low tide and my opportunity to cross the causeway before nightfall. At least he was home, I thought. Glancing around the room, I could see the walls were resplendent with sagging bookshelves crammed with various tomes, novels, manuscripts, and grimoires. The collection was eclectic and disorganized. Many of the books focused on topics such as geography, naval history, folklore, and ocean mythology. This is classic Marsh, I mused. How little he must have changed since I last saw him. One manuscript in particular stood out to me. Yellowed and frayed, it looked hopelessly ancient and crinkled next to the various books and tomes. I reached out gently with both hands and pulled it from where it had been sandwiched between a small leather-bound book titled De Vermis Mysteries and a large worm-eaten text called On Auspresslietenkulten. The manuscript appeared to have been well read, with notes scribed upon the cover haphazardly. The title, Things of the Water, was scrawled in a spidery handwritten script on the inside of the cover, with the words Kuthart Aquadinen in parentheses underneath. I moved closer to the glowing log burner and angled the manuscript so I could see more of the text inside, noticing some signs of fire damage along its edges. The light, however, did little to illuminate the actual purpose of the manuscript, as it moved dizzyingly from one topic to the next, with no discernible order. The best I could guess, it was some kind of a treatise on magic, with various formulas, sigils, and rituals scrawled upon it in various languages, most of which I could not recognize. Various queer hieroglyphs were illustrated on many of the pages, odd arrangements of star-like shapes with ocular patterns inside. One of the pages had an old charcoal sketch that had been crudely glued to the paper that appeared to depict an image so alien that I simply could not understand what the artist's intent behind it had been. I turned the manuscript over in my hands at every possible angle I could in vain hopes of making sense of the art. The best I could describe it was that it appeared to show a set of spherical shapes resembling bubbles mounted upon what looked like a mass of writhing, shadowy tendrils. Curiosity consuming me, I gently peeled away the bottom right corner, pulling away enough of the sketch to reveal some crabbed handwriting on the other side that simply read, "The Danforth Nightmare." The sound of boiling coffee disturbed my reading, and I quickly placed the manuscript back where I had found it before removing the pot from the stove. The smell of the coffee was warm and inviting as I strained the thick black liquid into 2 clay mugs I found on the counter nearby. I was about to call out to Howard once more, but the sounds of footsteps coming from beyond the kitchen made this unnecessary. Excitedly, I grabbed the 2 mugs and made my way into the hall, ready to surprise my friend. The sounds were coming directly from the door at the far end of the hallway, or more precisely, from the rickety iron staircase beyond. The footsteps were slow and heavy, but regular, and I guessed that Marsh was likely fatigued from a hard day of work. Still, there was something unaccountably off about the metallic thudding that accompanied the sound as it echoed in the chamber around the stairs. It was almost like a slapping sound, as if each step was being struck by something wet and damp that momentarily clung to its surface before being peeled away. As I strained to hear the strange footsteps growing closer, I noticed a pair of large boots placed at the base of the staircase. Though it was dark and shadowed beyond the door, I could see that these boots were prodigious in size, almost comically so. I couldn't make out their total composition, but they appeared to be perhaps as long as 15 inches, with a vast broadness across the width. There was something so singular and odd about the craftsmanship of the heel and arch of the boots that made them look more like flippers than footwear. The only comparison I could make at the time was the bespoke shoes one sometimes sees being worn by those born with legs of varying lengths or perhaps a prosthetic of some kind. The sounds were growing nearer, however, and regardless of the oddness behind my host's movement, I was growing excited to finally see him after so many years apart. That elation, however, swiftly left my body as Marsh finally appeared before me. I almost gasped as he rounded the staircase and came into sight. It was difficult at first to really understand just what it was that unnerved me enough to take a few steps back, spilling some of the scalding coffee on my hands. But as he came into view, it was painfully obvious that a great change had wrought itself upon him. He was tall, strikingly so. I had always been the taller of the 2 of us, but that was apparently no longer the case. He must have gained something like a foot in height from the last time I'd seen him. And even then, I could tell he was stooped at the shoulder, leaning forward in a queer manner that made him look awkward and stiff. His legs were long, even accounting for his height, and there was something strange about the area around his knees that I could not readily identify. He was, thankfully, I thought, heaped in all manner of thick clothing, including a large overcoat, a thick knitted jumper that covered his neck, and various scarves arranged around his face in a manner that suggested an ignorance of their true function. A gray cap was perched precariously atop his oddly elliptical head, and a pair of leather gloves lay stretched upon his large, flat hands and pulled across his long, spidery fingers. It was his eyes, however, that truly shocked me. Howard had always had large, protuberant eyes, but by some cruel method, be it injury or the strange malady he had alluded to in his letter, the space between them had unaccountably widened, pushing them far away from each other like opposing magnets, until they lay almost on the side of his head. They glowed too, or at least they did so for a brief moment as they were illuminated by the light of the hallway as he bent down and sat upon the step, reaching out for his colossal boots. With a great, awkward effort, he finally managed to fit his long, flat feet into the makeshift footwear, squeezing each other into their respective boot with an obvious strain. Though he had asked that I not be disturbed by his appearance, my reaction to him was uncontrollable, and for a brief moment, I thought about the revolver in my pocket. I could not think of any disease or genetic condition that could account for so drastic a change in my friend's countenance, much less the prestigious changes to his height and the length of his limbs. Finally, he walked towards me, lowering his head and bending down slightly in order to pass through the doorframe. Hypnotically, I reached out and passed him one of the mugs, which he took in his large hands, the size of which made the mug look like more than a child's teacup. Without saying a word, he gestured toward the kitchen with a nod of his misshapen head and shambled inside. Hesitating slightly, I reluctantly followed behind him as he lurched over to one of the two chairs. His crooked form was briefly illuminated by the glowing embers of the log burner, causing an amber nimbus to crown his body, making him appear even more alien and otherworldly. With a great flopping gesture, he awkwardly threw himself down into one of the chairs, causing the leather to creak in protest at his cumbersome bulk. The chair barely managed to contain him, and parts of his clothing, or perhaps even parts of his body, seemed to ooze and flow beyond its confines. Once seated, he looked towards me with his large eyes, which shined like opals in the glow of the fire, and bid me to join him. As I neared closer, I detected an awful fishy smell that seemed to linger over him. That intensified with proximity, and I shuddered internally to think of what manner of uncleanness could be responsible for such a stench. Finally, I joined my host at the fire and sat down myself, taking a sip of coffee, which frankly helped to mask the odor emanating from him. He said nothing, but continued to stare at me with those large, watery eyes, neither of which so much as twitched, let alone blinked, as we sat opposite one another in the shadowy dark. A few minutes passed, during which time he continued to glare at me in silence, ignoring the coffee in his hand. Unable to stand the oppressive quiet any longer, I pointed up towards the painting above the fireplace.
That's an interesting piece,
I said.
It's very well done. Is it yours?
Without taking his eyes off me, he nodded slowly. Then, from underneath the various scarves wrapped around the lower part of his face, I heard a guttural splutter, something halfway between a cough and a sigh. It was only by reluctantly leaning closer to him in the horrid stench that I was able to make out that he wasn't coughing at all, but speaking. Strange, choking words, hideously liquescent, were spilling forth from his melting mouth.
Yes, quietly. She belongs to me. A distant ancestor. Innsmouth. Lavinia Marsh.
His words chilled me, each syllable causing my skin to crawl. Though there was nothing at that particular moment to cause me to dread what he was saying, the way the words were punctuated with a disgusting, slimy emphasis unnerved me greatly. Whately, Innsmouth, and Lavinia in particular were spoken with a certain degree of clarity that gave me the impression that he was attempting to fight through the abundant phlegm nestling in his throat to attempt, at the very least, a particularly correct pronunciation.
Oh,
I replied numbly, not really knowing what to say.
well, she's very beautiful.
At this, his eyes did the impossible. They wandered even further and fixed upon me with an intensity that I could only describe as malicious.
I've brought you some things.
I stumbled, immediately changing the subject. I stood up and made my way over to the bag containing the tobacco and rum. The removal of my nostrils from that miasma of sickening fetor that surrounded me was a welcome reprieve and reason enough to move. But the way he glared at me when I mentioned the painting had me in a panic. Regardless, I produced the cigars and liquor from the bag, ignoring the sandwiches as the stench had killed any appetite I may have had. I turned to face him, goods in hand.
Look, your favorites, Island Gold and Hamlet's.
He was standing up now, his back facing me. I could see that he was removing the portrait from the fireplace, reverently holding it in his hands before placing it down by the side of his chair. I pretended not to notice and turned around once more to grab a box of matches from the bag, as well as 2 small glasses from a nearby cupboard. By the time I retrieved these, he had returned to his chair and was once more staring at me. I made my way back to my seat, sitting down and showing him the bottle of rum, before twisting the cap off and pouring us each a small glass of golden liquid. Once more, he reached forward with a giant hand and took what I offered him. Raising my glass, I attempted to cheerfully toast.
May the best of your yesterdays be the worst of your tomorrows.
But before I could finish, he had already thrust the glass underneath his scarf and drained the glass of its contents. The residue that remained on the glass after he had drunk from it momentarily caused bile to build up in the back of my throat. but I managed to conceal this from him. As revolting as he was, I felt pity for him and wondered just how horribly loathsome it must be to have such a dreadful affliction. Little wonder, I thought, that he chose to work alone in such a remote place. For some reason, this thought stuck in my mind, as if it had been incorrect in its assumption somehow. I quickly banished the thought, however, and finished my own drink, pouring us each another, ignoring the sticky mucus that clung to the lip of Howard's glass. He greedily slurped the second down quickly, just as he had the first, before thrusting his glass towards me and silently demanding a third. I knew the Island Gold had always been his drink of choice and happily refilled his glass. I then produced 2 cigars and offered him one, but to my surprise, and admittedly relief, he refused, pointing to his neck area and shaking his head. Given his labored breathing, I wondered if his condition would only be exacerbated by the smoke, and I asked if he would mind if I still lit one. He made a simple gesture that I took for confirmation, and striking a match, I lit my cigar and took a few deep puffs, sending a cloud of smoke into the air that mercifully masked the fishy smell marinating my host.
So,
I said, taking another pull of the cigar.
this is the final night for you then? This place is getting demolished next week?
The final night. Yes.
He replied, his voice still a sickening molasses.
And then what? Do you have anything else lined up?
Return to sea.
The sea? I would have thought you'd have had enough of that, Howard. What with Lenore and your stint in the Navy, is there no work on dry land that interests you?
None.
He flatly replied, gesturing for the bottle of rum by my side. I handed it to him, and to my horror, he shoved the whole bottle underneath his scarf and drank greedily and directly from it. No more rum for me, I lamented. Another period of silence passed between us, albeit one punctuated by the occasional slurping that accompanied each swig of rum my host took from the rapidly emptying bottle. In an effort to drown out the horrid sound, I attempted to resume conversation.
You mentioned in your letter that you visited Barton a few years ago. I'm curious, what caused you to visit my neck of the woods? I can't think of much in Barton that would attract outsiders.
Family. Kin in Barton. Marshes.
Oh, really? That's interesting. I knew a few of the Marshes living in town, but not personally, mind. Always kept to themselves. I remember old Sebastian Marsh. Poor fellow, how the children tormented him. Sad, really. I remember going down to the Gunner's Clough as a kid and seeing that strange cottage he lived in. It's not there anymore. I think some of the hooligans burned it down a few years back on Halloween. Nearly took the whole woodland with it. I wonder whatever happened to him.
Returned to sea.
He replied again, his words now even more slurred now that the rum had hit him.
How do you mean?
Returned to sea scale.
He replied, and I realized that he had simply stumbled on his words, and I had interjected too soon.
Oh, I see. Of course. I passed through Seascale on my way here, actually. Nice enough place, though it seems a little run down. I can't say I heard a good word of the Marshes there. It's strange, Barton is the same. To hear the old codgers tell it, you'd think the Marshes had come straight out of hell.
As the last word left my mouth, I suddenly became aware once more of my friend's shocking physical appearance, almost as if I had forgotten about it during my ramblings. Those sinister, unblinking eyes gazing directly into mine, and that hideous, labored breathing, and those awful, sputum-soaked words. He did look like something that had crawled out of the pit, and I shuddered as I half imagined what he must look like beneath the layers of clothing he was clearly wearing for the sole purpose of concealing his true face. Almost as if to banish the thought from my mind, I continued talking, desperate to maintain the illusion that I was talking to a fellow human being and not some alien entity that had come from the greater beyond.
I seem to recall Sebastian having a nephew, a boy around my age. Went insane from what I hear. They locked him up in Byron House. Do you remember me telling you about that place? Filled to the brim with loonies. His nephew, I can't remember his name, seemed to have developed an intense phobia of reflective surfaces. The spectrophobia, I think they call it. or isotrophobia.
Robert.
Yeah, Robert. His name wasn't Marsh, but his mother, she was a Marsh for sure, especially with those eyes. I winced internally, but continued. You know, us Whateleys are related in some way to the Marshes. At least that's what my grandfather used to say. Distant cousins, perhaps. I guess most people in Barton are related on some level, if you go back far enough. Birtles, Slaters, Quilts, Duncalfs, they're all intertwined in some way. My host continued to stare, not once acknowledging my words, or nodding in agreement or asking a question. His reticence was beginning to unnerve me, but I chalked it up to the great effort he needed to muster in order to speak. I switched topics, instead bringing up the research I had done at Seascale Library before joining him. As I sat in the dark and talked about the Devil's Spine, the Witch Mound, and the legend of Long Polly, he leaned in closer. Though he said little, occasionally nodding or grunting, I could tell that he was listening intently to every word I said. I couldn't help but feel like he was somehow growing suspicious of me in some way, as if I were discussing matters that should remain unsaid and buried forever in the annals of history. When I finally reached the topic of the strange whistling sound, teklili, that had occasionally been reported by locals, he shot up from his seat with alarming celerity and placed one of his hands towards me in protest. The gesture shocked me, and I watched in horror as he tilted his head towards the door of the room, angling at it as if waiting to hear something echo from the corridor beyond. When no sound came, he slowly sat back down into his chair and resumed his silent glaring. I decided to put some more coffee on the boil, which my host refused with a simple raising of one of his monstrous hands. I could feel the rum making me drowsy, and the thought of sleeping in the lighthouse was not one I wished to acknowledge. As I stood, waiting for the coffee, I happened to glance out the window close by. The tide had returned, and the whole island was now surrounded by black, churning waves that crashed and sprayed upon the sharp rocks beyond the cottage. The lighthouse beacon, still displaying that strange green-gold beam, occasionally swept over the waves as I watched. As it passed by, I could swear that for a brief moment I could make out some other kind of movement out in the water. It appeared to be something in the undercurrent, and as a wave crashed and settled upon the surface, I could make out ripples of something else beneath the surface, something moving. The closest approximation my mind could conjure at the time was that of a large school of fish swarming under the water, and I turned to ask Howard about the phenomenon, but found that he was rising from his chair once more. He stood up, his head almost touching the cottage ceiling, and with one of his hands, reached down and took the portrait of Lavinia that he had so oddly removed from the mantelpiece. "Is everything all right?" I asked, attempting to hide the discomfort in my voice. He pointed up to the ceiling.
The beacon must check.
And with that, he left the room, stooping and shambling out of the door. I heard those flat, slapping footsteps make their way towards the entrance of the lighthouse door, and then slowly fade out of my hearing range with a few soft echoes on the stairwell. Somewhat relieved by his absence, I returned to my seat, but not before retrieving the manuscript marked Things of the Water from where I'd left it. For whatever reason, something in that odious tome had lodged itself in the back of my mind, something that I had perhaps skimmed past that refused to leave me in peace. Sitting down and lighting another cigar, I reasoned that my host's telltale footsteps would quickly alert me to his presence, and I could simply put the manuscript back where I had found it without him realizing. I could not say exactly why I was so reluctant for him to see me reading it. It was, after all, simply an odd collection of texts. But I found myself loath to be caught with it in my possession. He had acted so strangely towards my retelling of Cumbrian folklore that I worried he would react even more aggressively should he discover me reading the manuscript. Flicking through once more, careful not to let the cigar ash collect in the central crease, I came across several hideous pages of forgotten lore that chilled me as I sat alone in the dark. More monstrous woodprint images and sketches of strange creatures and beings danced on the yellowed pages, illuminated by the dying embers of the fire, freakish entities with names like Ubal Sathwa, the unforgotten source, Hastur, the unspeakable, the great Cthulhu, the last of which was said to slumber eternally, dead but dreaming in the phantom city of Rylea, deep beneath the gloomy waters where no light can penetrate.
Again, I returned to the horrid sketch marked the Danforth Nightmare, but this time I found a cross-reference to the image on another page that was titled Shoggoth of the Lost City. This too was a disgusting mass of black tendrils and ocular spheres with no discernible central structure to make sense of the ungodly arrangement of eyes, mouths, and less obvious organs. Another reference on this page led me to the section marked Dagons Mirror, which was accompanied by an ancient woodblock image of what I guessed must be the eponymous ornament. At first, the picture appeared to simply depict an ornate mirror, Baroque in style and decorated with intricate carvings upon its frame. But closer inspection revealed that most of the images were disgusting hybrids of human and fish and other oceanic creatures, the likes of which I had never seen. I could not help but think that some of these carvings were attempts to give form to the strange names I had read in the manuscript, and wondered if the queer amalgamations of octopi, anema, and crustaceans were meant to depict Ubu Safla or Great Cthulhu. It was then, after turning the page, that I came across the item that unnerved me far greater and with an awful intensity than any of the previous drawings, incantations, and rituals combined. It dropped onto my lap as I angled the manuscript closer with the light of the fire. It was a small folded up piece of paper. Placing the rest of the tome to the side, I unfolded the object, expecting to be greeted by another monstrous sketch, but instead found it to be a letter.
Dear Mr. Elliot, the Ubo formula you sent me did indeed work, and through it I was able to glimpse the depths of Johannithle, and beyond even that, to the corpse city of Relaya. I cannot say where I will make the trip to first, providing of course that the sign works as intended. As you are already aware, my time on this plane is fleeting, and the transformation has only been accelerated by my use of the formula. The mirror is indeed a conduit between this earth and those who dwell outside. Its original purpose, as far as I can tell, was to call them down from the stars as well as spy upon those who dwell in different times and different spaces. Its creator is believed to be none other than Ubdul Alhazred, the author of that dread tome we call the Necronomicon. I have also read, however, that it is even older than this, with some texts stating that it hails originally from some unnamed city of brass domes and rubied spires that once dominated the southern plains of the lost Hyborian age. The Order of Dagon, fearing that the mirror could be used to summon the dread protoplasmic horror from beyond the 6,000 steps, had the thing removed from Innsmouth, where it eventually found its way into Dunwich. They could not destroy it, you understand? For even the Deep Ones fear the reprisals of he who is not to be named. My grandmother, Lavinia Whately, through her inhuman father, inherited the mirror and fled Innsmouth with that rogue warlock, Abner Marsh. I cannot tell you exactly how I came to acquire the mirror. There are of course other parties involved in this matter who wish to remain nameless. However, as promised, should you find time to attend the next Walpurgis Sabbath, I will introduce you to Mr. Pendle's latest form as well as that extraordinary painter of nightmarish canvases, the immortal Mr. Bickham. This will be my last letter to you. For now, recite the incantation of the Black Goat every 7th night, and you will know the faceless things of the air who take their body from human blood, and you may call upon them to take you to Sabbath, should you choose to join me there. It is likely that by this time, my transformation will be complete, and I will be in a much stronger position to show you the final seal that will awaken the Shoggoth. I am yours in the name of Father Dagon and Mother Hydra, Sebastian Frederick Marsh.
I reread that several times, stunned by the name that only a few hours ago I had discussed with Howard. Could this really be the same Sebastian? Surely it must be, for the coincidence was too great to consider. Howard had mentioned that he had visited Barton. He even spoke of the gunner's cloth. Could it be that this very manuscript once resided in that crumbling cottage? Its frog-faced owner poring over the incantations and formulas to commit some kind of hellish witchcraft? I cannot say for certain how long I sat there in the dark with the manuscript and that terrible letter. There was no sign of my host, and the coffee I had made had long since grown cold. The fire had almost died, and I hastily threw a few more logs onto the embers.
determined that the darkness would be kept at bay by its light and warmth. The roaring of the waves outside had intensified, and they were now accompanied by a howling wind that blustered around the cottage, rattling the windows and driftwood doors like dry bones. Despite the waves and the wind and the occasional cracking of fresh logs, I must have somehow managed to drift off, for my mind was carried away into the blissful oblivion we call slumber. It was the last restful sleep of my life. It was the blast of the foghorn that awoke me suddenly from the dreamless sleep, jolting me as if I had been struck by a thunderbolt. It bellowed out again from the top of the lighthouse tower, so close and so loud that it caused the very walls of the cottage to shake. The waves outside were crashing with an intensity I had never heard before, and when I peered out from the window, the black rolling mass was now only 20 or so feet away from the cottage. They had somehow risen to engulf most of the island, leaving behind only a small patch of rocks upon which the lighthouse and cottage now stood precariously. Again, the foghorn roared, so loud this time that I covered my ears with my hands. Frantically, I left the room and made my way towards the lower staircase, determined to see if I could find my host and ask him to cease the infernal bellowing, or at the very least, find something to cover my ears. Upon reaching the doorway to the stairs, I was once more greeted with that god-awful fishy stink that seemed to cling to Howard and all that he touched. I could see that his large, misshapen boots had once more been placed at the base of the stairs, and I made my way over, producing the flashlight I had brought with me. The feeble beam managed to penetrate the darkness of the stairwell, but not so much as to banish the oppressive darkness of the tower base. I stepped over the boots, covering my nose from the stench that was covering them. Slowly, flashlight in hand, I began my ascent up the rickety staircase, which spiraled upwards and into the shadowy blackness above. I could make out a glow at the very top, the same phantom golden green that had emanated from the beacon. It was then that I noticed the first piece of discarded clothing on the stairs. It was one of the scarves Howard had worn around his face. The torchlight revealed that it was covered in some translucent jelly, something akin to frog spawn, I thought. I did my best to avoid coming into contact with whatever disgusting organic mass it may have been, only to find more clothing articles as I continued my journey upwards. A coat, some more scarves, a knitted jumper, a cap, even a pair of trousers. Each was either dripping with a gelatinous mess or encrusted with a stale yellow-green deposit that resembled fish scales. The last article, a stained vest, was found just outside the service room at the very top of the stairs. The glow from the beacon was now more intense, creating a nimbus of light that faintly illuminated the workbench and various boxes stacked against the walls of the cramped room. A small wooden ladder led to a trapdoor above, through the cracks of which the strange light shined even more intensely. I paused at the base of the ladder. The foghorn had not sounded again since I started my ascent, and I prayed that it would not do so. At this proximity, it was likely to deafen me. There were, however, several other sounds coming from beyond the trapdoor. One was that awfully familiar slapping sound of Howard's large feet pacing back and forth above me. The other were voices. One a croaking, coughing, guttural sound that I took to be Howard, and the other was a softer, feminine voice, seductive and gentle. Making out what they were saying was difficult, and so I gingerly took the ladder and made my way up, slowly pushing the trapdoor just enough to see and hear what lay beyond. The glow was blinding. The lighthouse lens appeared to have ceased revolving and was instead now fixed in place. Attached to the lens by means both mechanical and electrical was an object that almost caused me to cry out in panic, for it was the mirror, Dagons Mirror. That loathsome device illustrated and discussed by Sebastian Marsh in that dreaded manuscript, replicated before me with abominable accuracy. Though I could only make out part of the mirror through the glow, it looked even more hideous, resplendent in its full ornate horror and oceanic regalia. The light casting from its surface was impossibly radiant, making it difficult to see who or what was also in the beacon chamber with me. I could see a figure which I took to be Howard, given the odd proportions and contours of his body that I was now fearfully familiar with. He was indeed pacing back and forth, each movement and jerk of his body a blasphemous mockery of human gesticulation. Mercifully, I could not see his face, only the outline of his elliptical head, and each time he spoke, he turned to face the surface of the mirror. The woman's voice I could not place.
However, it almost appeared to echo around the chamber with no obvious source. I could not tell if it was something that existed only within the confines of my own mind, or if it was some kind of floating specter all around me. It was only Howard's voice that repeated certain words or spoke in response to the woman's voice that convinced me that what I was hearing was real and not
The
imagined.
stars are right. The blood of this last offering will awaken the spawn of Ubu Salvala, of Ubu Safa, the blasphemous abomination without form from beyond the 6,000 steps. It will awaken Father Dagon and Mother Hydra from the fathomless depths, and we will dance and frolic for all time.
But he is my friend.
Howard's voice replied, somehow clearer and more human than before.
I gave you the keepers here. I gave you my wife, my children. How many more? You promised that when this was over, I could go back. I don't want to be this thing anymore.
And you shall, my child. The old ones have that power. They can reverse the process, if that is what you truly desire.
It is.
Howard replied, stopping before the mirror.
I don't want to go back to the sea. I don't want to dance forever in the dark. Pickman was right. I don't want to live forever.
Then give me this man. This. Allow him to take your place. His blood will open the final seal and awaken the Shoggoth. You will be free. You will return to the wretched world of men.
Yes.
Howard proclaimed, excited now.
Yes. What I desire.
The guttural, phlegmy tone had returned to his voice now, drowning out the humanity that had briefly surfaced within him.
Then bring him to me. Bring him and you will be free of your great burden.
I sensed movement, and then suddenly he was upon the trapdoor. I could not tell if he had heard me or was simply on his way to claim me from where he thought I must be in the study, but his motions were too fast for me to react to. The light from the mirror struck me as the trapdoor flew open, and I shielded my eyes from the blinding glare. I heard a terrible sound, something akin to a mix of shock and ravenous excitement came from Howard's inhuman lips, and then I felt a gnarled claw reach out and grab me, pulling me off of the ladder and up into the chamber above. The glow was now overwhelming, and I couldn't make out much beyond the mirror. I couldn't see his face, but I knew it was the Howard fish thing that had a hold of me.
Fool! They want you, Whately! They are taking you, not me! Down to the depths you go! Down the 6,000 steps to the Shoggoth!
I fumbled frantically, desperate to retrieve the old service revolver from my pocket, praying to whatever god would listen to me that when I find it, it still worked. My other hand I used to hopelessly try to wrangle free from his vice-like grip, but it was too strong. I felt my fingers move across his awfully wet and scaly arm as he lifted me higher, and I could now feel the top of my head glance across the chamber ceiling. He was taking me towards the mirror and closer to the sounds of the unseen woman's sardonic laughter.
Howard!
I screamed.
If you're in this somewhere, please let me go! I don't want to hurt you!
Me? You cannot hurt me! I am eternal!
He laughed once more, but by this time, I had found the revolver. The feeling of its grip in my palm, a blessed relief. I pulled the gun free, and unable to truly see what I was firing at, I cocked the hammer back and pulled the trigger. The shot boomed in the chamber, causing the sharp ringing to spike in my ears. I must have struck something, for I heard him cry out in pain, though his grip on me did not cease. I fired again, another shot ripping through the air, and this time he mercifully let go, roaring with an inhuman cry. Now on my knees, with no time to stand, I fired a third shot. This one missed, instead ricocheting off the iron window frame and striking the surface of the mirror. I heard a deep and low cracking sound, like a whaler breaking through the thick Arctic ice, followed by a crystalline shattering sound as the brilliant radiance around us vanished, plunging the entire chamber into blackness. I heard the faint cry of a woman scream out in pain as a million shards cascaded to the floor.
No!
No!
Howard screamed, his bulk floundering on the floor. I wasted no time and, mad with panic, leapt down through the trap door and towards the staircase. I heard something heavy drop behind me, followed by the frantic slapping of inhuman feet. I did not have a plan. I just knew that I did not want to stop running, even if it meant drowning in the waves outside, for the merciful embrace of Titan was preferable to facing the horror behind me. The speed at which I descended the stairs must have been prestigious, as each article of Howard's discarded clothing caused me to jump several steps of stairs in one bound. I think I injured my ankles, but the adrenaline coursing through my body allowed me to continue. I heard my pursuer roar behind me, spitting out all manner of curses and threats as I reached the bottom of the staircase. I could see the driftwood door at the other end of the corridor that led to freedom and hobbled forward, hearing something heavy hit the ground directly behind me. In one last burst of mad hysteria, I quickly turned heel and, with my eyes closed, fired the remaining 3 shots in the direction of the stairs. The first 2 must have missed, but the last found its mark. I heard another scream of rage and pain. I turned and sprinted as fast as my legs would allow towards the door, slamming into it with my shoulder. The wind outside was howling madly, and the black waves were now even closer to the cottage than before. Barely 10 feet of jagged rock stood between me and the briny depths. It was then that I saw the sight that mercifully permitted me to pass out and escape from this nightmarish scene. For the waves around me were frothing and foaming, not from the wind, but from the mass of hideous creatures breaching the surface. A nightmare legion of unblinking eyes and slimy mouths. A horde of batrachian monstrosities resembling nothing less than the awful fish frogs carved onto the frame of what Sebastian had called Dagons Mirror. They bleated and croaked, hopping in and out of the lapping waters in a ghoulish frenzy. I thought of the gun in my hand and cursed that I had no shots remaining. If only I had saved one for myself, I thought. Behind me, I heard Howard suddenly cry out in a panic. Turning, the waves and the wind battering me from all sides, I could see the waters surround the entrance of the cottage. Dark waves crashed and smashed upon the outer walls, breaking the windows and flooding the inside. The horde was upon Howard now, clawing at him, pulling him into the water. A dozen flabby claws clung to his scaly body, dragging him into the briny depths where he belonged.
No!
He screamed in panic, his human voice returning to plead with his captors.
I don't want to go! Take him! Leave me be!
The sight of Howard in all his horror was enough to send my mind reeling into oblivion. Although his body was identical to that of the fish frogs pulling him down into the waves, there was a vestigial likeness of the man I once knew still stretched across that monstrous face. He looked at me with all the malice he could muster. As I felt the sweet embrace of nothingness consume me, those final words cried out in the coming darkness that I happily welcomed.
Gods curse you, Whately! Curse you to Hades! Get back, you devils! Back, I say! Oh God! Oh Lord! Help my poor soul!
It was morning when I finally awoke, and the sight of the amber sun rays breaking over the Cumbrian countryside was nothing less than glorious. I picked myself up. I gazed out at the now calm waters of the Irish Sea and the lapping waves gently breaking upon the shore. There was no sign of the lighthouse. The island it had once sat upon and the causeway leading to it were barely visible over the morning's retreating tide. But the tower, along with the adjacent cottage, were no more. Lost forever and scattered across the seabed, home to nothing more than clinging barnacles and skittering crabs. They never found Howard's body, nor the bodies of the 3 men who had worked at the lighthouse. I later learned that Trinity House, the authority responsible for maintaining the St. Michael's Lighthouse, had no record of a Howard Marsh in their employ. Though he is gone, I think of him often. I have dreams, vivid, terrible dreams, in which he is forced to eternally dance and frolic in the forgotten and fathomless depths of the corpse city, forced to live forever as one of the fish things, longing for the day when he and the rest of his kind shall rise up out of the ocean and reclaim the earth in the name of the father Dagon and the mother Hydra. Though the horror he and Lavinia had sought to unleash upon the world had been dispelled, I cannot help but wonder what became of the mirror. Surely it is gone, its thousand shards swept out across the seabed, and its hideous frame bent and warped by the waves' ceaseless crashing. I wonder if such a thing can ever truly be destroyed. And what of Shoggoth? Has that formless horror been returned to its eternal slumber beneath the 6,000 steps that lay deep below the witch mound? I can only pray that it has. And yet, every night I hear it. Whenever Howard creeps into my dreams and I see his awful face and hear his awful voice, there is something else, something outside, something beyond. I can hear it now as I write down these words.